This video has every Italian idea, principle, and fundamental that you need to understand how Italian fully operates as a language. After watching this video, you'll have a good basis of Italian and understand how to utilize its grammar properly. In essence, this video is a long compilation of all of my previous videos that explain every Italian grammatical concept individually, so that way you don't have to search for each one on its own. Everything that you need in Italian is in this video. When watching it, some moments will have weird sentences, like, "This concept is for a future video," because all of my videos are edited into one. I tried my best to balance everything so that the audio and visuals all come as one. As I said, this is a simple collection of all of my previous videos, so obviously I cannot go back and re-edit them. In the description, you'll also find links to many of the Italian concepts. I left them for you to extend your knowledge of Italian. If you're curious about Italian, or if you think that I explained something poorly, you can check them out. Those links will take you to separate sites where you will find more explanations of Italian concepts. I'm not saying that my source is the best, because all I did was take out all of the unnecessary fat, providing you with a virtual audio and visual dictionary of Italian grammar. Use it as you wish. You can change the speed, adjust the sound, check this video in one day or many days, and simply find a time that fits you. Even if you already know Italian or have an average level, you can now know what you need to enhance. With this video, you can teach yourself, build sentences, practice speaking Italian, understand the nuances of the language, and revisit it as many times as you want. If you think that I made any mistakes or missed any other crucial concepts, you can correct me or add your own input in the comments. Still, I did make some typos when explaining, such as saying one word, but on the screen you'll see a different word. At the bottom of the description, you'll see the timestamps for all typos, so in case you see one, you can know what was the actual word. I also have timestamps for every concept, so that way you don't have to waste time looking for the concept you need. Just click on the time and you will be taken to that concept. I would recommend watching the entire video from start to finish, so that way you can improve the concepts that you already know, along with learning newer ones. Anyhow, enjoy. Number 1. Italian is a Romance language which is Latin-based, so it uses the same alphabet and letters as English. However, the letters J, K, W, X, and Y are not part of the Italian alphabet and are considered foreign. They're mainly used for loanwords, scientific terms, and proper names, as native Italian words typically use other letters to show similar sounds. In any case, many English and Italian words have common roots, because both languages borrow heavily from Latin. Number 2. Italian has accents on vowels, and they're necessary for words that are stressed on the final syllable, certain verb forms, and some homographs that are spelled the same but pronounced with different stress. Although the topic of accents is for the alphabet, it's important to mention it beforehand. In short, Italian has the grave accent and the acute accent, but in writing, the grave accent is the standard and dominates more, while the acute accent only appears on a few words. Either way, accents are vital because they're mainly used for final stress, clarity, and a few verb forms. Number 3. The word order is basic, like in English, consisting of a subject, verb, and object. But there are key differences, like adjectives coming after nouns and objects, and pronouns that are placed before the verb. Number 4. Italian verb tenses have similar functions to English, consisting of the present, past, future, conditional, and imperative. Even if the concepts are formed differently, they're still the same, sharing identical punctuation and writing concepts, like periods, commas, and question marks. Number 5. Italian is much more inflected than English, which means that it has grammatical gender, masculine or feminine, which affects articles, adjective forms, and verb agreements in compound tenses. For instance, the expressions il ragazzo, la ragazza, una casa grande show a distinction in gender, where articles and adjectives must agree in gender and number. English does not have this concept, so it's something to get used to. Number 6. Conjugation is central in Italian because verbs change for person and number, having endings for verb conjugations. Italian verbs are also categorized into 3 main groups based on their infinitive endings: are, ere, and ire. Each group has a different conjugation pattern, and within the ere and ire groups, many verbs are irregular. Number 7. Italian pronouns function differently, especially those that are object and reflexive pronouns. While a pronoun is placed after a conjugated verb in English, such tiny words can move before the verb, attach to the verb, or merge with other forms in Italian. This is a fairly complex concept, but it will become logical. Number 8. Italian has a formal U, consisting of tu and lei. Tu is the informal U, which is used with friends, family, and peers. On the other hand, lei is the formal U that is used with respect, strangers, and professionals, and it follows third-person grammatical rules. Number 9. Italian has more articles than English, which makes them more frequent and creates general meanings. As such, the language uses articles in many contexts where English doesn't, like subjects, possessives, days of the week, and countries, apart from placing them before nouns. Number 10. Italian pronunciation is far simpler than English and is more consistent and phonological. Every letter corresponds to one sound, unlike English, yet Italian is more complex with double consonants and open and closed e and o. For example, double consonants are pronounced with a longer sound and require a slight pause before them. This doubling can change the meaning of a word, so correct pronunciation is needed, like in the words palla, 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 casa, cassa, casa, cassa. All consonants can be doubled in Italian, except H. And for this reason, reading will be very simple once you get used to it. Number 11. Italian has 2 main verbs that express to be, essere and stare. However, essere is the main verb for to be, which is used for identity, origin, essential characteristics, passive voice, and location in many cases. On the other hand, stare can be translated as to be, but it's far more restricted. It expresses temporary conditions, location in some contexts, the progressive tense, and certain idiomatic expressions. This topic should be thoroughly explained in a separate video, but the concept does create a distinction between something permanent and temporary. Number 12. Italian has the aspect of a progressive tense, but it's used lexically and not grammatically. This means that Italian can express progression, which is equivalent to be plus ing in English. However, while this form exists, the language uses it less often because in spoken Italian, the simple present is more common, while the progressive would emphasize that an action is happening right now, using stare plus a gerund. It also explains why stare is used, because it's needed for temporary progressive actions. In English, we use was or were plus ing for continuous actions, while in Italian, the imperfect past tense is sufficient. In other words, Italian does not need stare plus a gerund for a continuous action, because the imperfect already shows progression. The difference is that Italian marks it only when necessary, for duration and incompleteness. Number 13. Italian has a lot of variations in its past tense. While this may be a confusing element in the language, it is helpful to understand the conceptual system. Italian doesn't just have the past tense like English, saying I ate or I was eating. Instead, it has multiple ways to talk about the past, and each one carries a nuance about how the speaker views an action, whether it's completed, ongoing, habitual, or literary. In essence, Italian has several compound tenses which are formed by combining a conjugated auxiliary verb, avere, to have, or essere, to be, with a past participle. While such concepts need to be explained separately in future videos, I will just mention them here, so you know what to expect. The most common past form is the conversational present perfect, describing completed past actions and focusing on the result of an action. This tense overlaps with two English tenses, the simple past, as in ate, or the present perfect, as in have eaten. It also uses the auxiliary verbs avere or essere, followed by a past participle. Another form is the imperfect past, which describes ongoing and habitual past actions. In English, this can mean using was or were doing, used to do, or a long-lasting past tense. English also splits this concept across the progressive tense, while Italian expresses it all with the imperfect. Another form is the past perfect, which is a familiar concept in English, expressing had done. This form describes an action that happened before another past action, also using auxiliary verbs. A different form is the simple literary past, which is not to be confused with the present perfect. This tense is mainly used for the distant past and literary narratives, and it's equivalent to the English simple past, but is stylistically elevated in Italian. The last form is the remote past perfect, which is a literary version of the tense. This form is extremely historical and archaic, which is common in formal storytelling. To conclude this point, Italian has many past forms because the language evolved from Latin, which had rich verb systems with past nuances. While learning to speak Italian, many past expressions will be compound or imperfect, and the rest are literary. So, Italian has more distinctions in the past, while English compresses them. Number 14. Italian has a lot of variations in the subjunctive mood, expressing things that are unreal, using emotion, doubt, desire, and necessity, which all lead to the idea of possibility and uncertainty. While English can have modal verbs, tone, or specific structures, Italian uses the subjunctive similarly. If you have seen my French grammar video, I give a thorough explanation of the subjunctive mood because it's the same fundamental in any language. Italian will have the same format towards the end of the grammar because generally many learners know what it's used for but don't understand the purpose of the mood. The generic definition is that it's used for emotion, doubt, desire, and necessity. But in reality, all of these ideas express possibility and uncertainty. It's also why the subjunctive is a mood and not a tense, because the mood is a temporary state of mind. I indicate this in the beginning so that you can understand what the subjunctive actually means. And in Italian, there are 4 variations. The present subjunctive is used when the main verb expresses uncertainty, and this form is the most common in spoken Italian. The imperfect subjunctive is used after some expressions when referring to the past, or in hypothetical situations. It's also the second most common variation in Italian speech. The past subjunctive has a compound form with a past participle, which is used when the action happened before the main verb. This form is the third most common. The last variation is the past perfect subjunctive, consisting of auxiliary verbs and past participles. It's used for the past before the past, especially in hypothetical and literary writing, and it's almost never used in spoken Italian. In conclusion, Italian has many subjunctives because it allows very precise distinctions, especially in the past, and this idea makes the language incredibly expressive. Overall, these are things to know before learning Italian, and in the next videos, Italian grammar can begin, and grammatical concepts can be learned. The Italian alphabet has 21 traditional letters, which are the same as in English. Because the alphabet is more phonological, it consists of phonetic rules, but the pronunciation will be different, because Italian is a Romance language. The letters, their pronunciations, and spellings look like this: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, Z. Aside from the conventional Italian letters, the language also has imported letters that are foreign, and they're spelled and pronounced like this: Ilunga, K, W, X, Y. These letters do not belong to native Italian spelling and were taken from foreign languages like English and Greek. Still, Italian speakers recognize them perfectly in foreign words, scientific terms, and proper names, like jeans, karate, web, taxi, yoga. For the most part, all vowels and many consonants have the same sound as in English, but some letters deviate in pronunciation, like chi, h, z, ilunga, and y. Nonetheless, the sounds of the letters stay the same, and almost every letter corresponds to one sound, because Italian pronunciation is more phonetic than English. This concept will be very simple to utilize, so now that we know the pronunciation of the alphabet, we can continue with sound rules. The first rule to know is the soft chi and g before e or e. When these consonants are placed before such vowels, they become soft, as in cena and gelato. The English equivalent is ch, as in chair, and the J sound. Oppositely, if chi and g are placed before a, o, or u, they will have a hard sound, like in the words cane and gatto. Even so, Italian can force the hard sound of the consonants before e or e, and we do so by adding h between them, like in chi and ghiaccio. The second rule to know is the combination of G plus L and G plus N. Such letters make unique sounds when combined, and they're pronounced like a soft L or N sound. Some examples are famiglia, figlio, gnocco, montagna. The third rule is double consonants, which are pronounced longer and can change the meanings of words. Any consonant can be doubled except H. English does not have this concept, but once you listen to the difference, the pronunciation will feel natural. Some examples are palla, 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 sete, sette, sete, sette. The fourth rule is that H is always silent and has no sound. Its only purpose is to harden chi and G, and to distinguish the forms of vowels, like in the phrases O, A, I. The fifth rule is that esse and zeta have two pronunciations, which are very common in Italian vocabulary. This is something that you simply have to get used to, but some patterns can help you predict which pronunciation to use. For instance, sole and sasso have an unvoiced s sound, while rosa and casa have a voiced z sound. When using zeta, it can have two possible sounds, ts and z, like in pizza and zaino. The sixth rule is that the letter Q is always written as it sounds, but it's pronounced qu, qu. This pronunciation is very similar to Spanish, if you know that, like in the words cuatro, quattro, questo, questo, quando, quando. After learning these rules, we now have a good comprehension of how consonants sound in Italian, considering that vowels have pure sounds, and they do not deviate as in English. Now, we can take a look at accents, which are very important to know in the language, because they emphasize stress in any word. The general rules for accents are that they produce stress on the final syllable of a word, mark open vowel sounds for e and o, and indicate the meaning in words. Because their use is restricted, they mostly appear on vowels at the end of a word, so when you learn Italian vocabulary, this is where you'll find many of them. The accents themselves are the grave accent and the acute accent, but in writing, the grave accent dominates more. When it comes to using the accents, vowels like a, e, and u will rarely have them, but you will still find them in words like la, si, virtù. Such words use the grave accent, but the remaining vowels, e and o, will commonly appear with this accent, like in caffè, però, andrò. Most Italian final accents are grave, but we also have to see the acute accent, which is mainly used on e, rarely on o, and never on a, e, or u. This accent is needed to mark closed vowel sounds, and we can hear the difference in comparison with the grave accent. Listen carefully. E, 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 o, 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 o. Practically, Italian standard spelling almost always uses e for the closed e at the end of a word, and e for the open one. This explains why the acute accent is common on e, like in the words perché, ne, poiché, 23. On the other hand, the accent is rare to see on o, because it mainly appears in dictionaries. In short, Italian has these accents to stress the last syllable of a word, to distinguish homophones, and to show vowel openness, mostly in dictionaries, minimal pairs, and poems or music. Even so, they can distinguish the difference in monosyllables and can appear on a few verb forms, specifically in the literary pasts. Overall, this is how the alphabet, its sounds, and its rules work in Italian. Every word is pronounced as written, one letter equals one sound, with a few exceptions, and stress rules are predictable. In Italian, every noun has a grammatical gender, masculine or feminine, and gender affects nouns, articles, and adjectives, so learning patterns from the beginning can help you understand how to identify gender in the language. To identify masculine objects, we can look for nouns ending in o or foreign nouns, which almost always will be masculine, like il libro, il ragazzo, un treno, il film, il bar. At the same time, we can find the ending e, which means that a noun can be masculine or feminine, but most are masculine, like il fiore, il cane, il mare. To identify feminine objects, also look at noun endings such as a, ione, and trice. Most nouns that have these endings will be feminine, like la casa, la ragazza, una mela, la stazione, la televisione, la regione, la direttrice. The patterns that we've seen work most of the time, but sometimes we can find irregular endings that will have their own gender, such as nouns ending in ta and ma. Such nouns are typically taken from Greek. The ta ending is often feminine, even if it feels neutral, like the words la città, la università. On the other hand, nouns that end in ma are often masculine, even though they end in a, like il problema, il tema, il clima, il sistema. Some nouns do not change when plural, and these often come from Greek, like il cinema, I cinema. Moreover, some nouns that end in e can be unpredictable, even though most are masculine. Still, these can be masculine or feminine, and you memorize them over time, like il ponte, il mese, il latte, la notte, la mente, la sete. When it comes to natural gender, such as people and animals, nouns take gender based on the biological sex of the object, like il professore, la professoressa, il gatto, la gatta, il cugino, la cugina, il figlio, la figlia. Some use the same form, but change the article, like il cantante, la cantante. After learning how to identify gender, it's important to see articles, which in Italian are affected by gender and number. First, we can see masculine definite articles. The, and both singular and plural articles can change. Il is used before most consonants. Lo comes before special consonants. Le, with an apostrophe, is used before vowels. Il libro, lo studente, l'amico. When the articles become plural, they will also change. Il becomes I, and lo and le become li, as in I libri, gli studenti, gli amici. Despite a lot of rules, these are necessary in Italian because they make certain nouns sound better with articles. You might have also noticed how Italian contracts articles and pluralizes nouns, which is something I'll show a bit later. When it comes to feminine definite articles, the singular use la before consonants, like la casa, and l before vowels, like l'amica. All plural feminine nouns use le, like le case, le amiche. Now we can see indefinite articles, a, an, which are also gender-based. Masculine indefinite articles are un, coming before most consonants and vowels, and uno, coming before special consonants. Un libro, un amico, uno studente. As a note, un never contracts before vowels. That's why un amico doesn't have an apostrophe. Feminine indefinite articles are una before consonants and un with an apostrophe before vowels, like una casa, un'amica, un'idea. After learning the articles, we can see apostrophes in Italian, which appear to avoid two vowels clashing. This concept applies to both genders, which explains why previously in the video you may have seen many words with apostrophes. At the same time, Italian can merge some prepositions with definite articles, again for sound purposes. When learning to speak Italian, there are many that you can find, but the most common ones appear with di, meaning of or from, with the articles that we've seen. Del, dello, del, dei, degli, delle. If you want to know all contractions, here's a chart that connects prepositions and articles. Even though you may not use all of them, it's still interesting to see how many combinations are possible. This can seem like a lot, but once you learn when to use them, the concept will be simple. The reason why apostrophes and contractions combine is to avoid two vowel sounds. So if a contraction ends in a vowel and the next word starts with a vowel, an apostrophe is used. At last, we can see how Italian pluralizes nouns. For masculine nouns, we change the ending o or e to i, like in the words libro, libri, cane, cani. For feminine nouns, change a to e and e to i. Casa, case, mente, menti. For irregular nouns, especially those that end in co and go, change them to chi, chi, gi, gi. This is done to keep the pronunciation consistent. Amico, amici, parco, parchi, lago, laghi, albergo, alberghi. On the other hand, nouns that end in ka and ga will end in ke or ge when plural. Amica, amiche, riga, righe. Some nouns will take the same form when singular and plural, specifically those that end in a, u, I, and foreign nouns. Some are accented, others have a Greek origin, and the rest are foreign. Additionally, nouns ending in ma have a Greek origin and are masculine, so they pluralize like regular masculine nouns. Il problema, I problemi, il tema, I temi, il clima, I climi. If all of this sounds too confusing, you can take a look at this chart that summarizes the concept of how to pluralize nouns. It may seem like a lot, but it will be simple to get used to, because Italian grammar is straightforward, considering that we've seen gender and articles. Sentence structure and word order in Italian are generally straightforward, but some nuances exist. Like English, Italian typically follows a subject, a verb, and an object, like Maria mangia una mela. Maria eats an apple. Still, Italian is more flexible because verb endings show who the subject is. Omitting the subject pronoun is a common idea because verb conjugations are sufficient in telling who the action refers to, unless emphasis is needed. A standard saying can be, parlo italiano. I speak Italian. To make it emphatic, we can say, io parlo italiano. Such examples use verb conjugations, which will be explained in a future video. A big difference in word order is that usually adjectives come after nouns, but in English, they come before, like saying, una casa grande, a big house. However, some adjectives can come before the noun to change meaning or add tone, like una grande casa, meaning a great house. In general, meaning can shift depending on position because Italian has more nuances. When it comes to adverbs, they typically come after the verb or between auxiliaries and past participles, which will also be shown in future videos. An example can be parla lentamente. She speaks slowly. Ho già mangiato. I have already eaten. In questions, Italian doesn't require inversion like in English, and instead, we can form a question by simply elevating our tone. For instance, tu vieni. You're coming. Tu vieni? Are you coming? This is a common way to ask questions in Italian, but we can also use question words to emphasize the meaning, like dove abiti? Where do you live? Although I said that Italian does not need inversion, sometimes it is possible to use it, but it's uncommon and formal, as in vieni tu? Are you the one coming? Moreover, Italian has a special placement for pronouns, which is very important. But again, a separate video is needed for the concept. For this video, we'll just mention the word order. Because Italian has clitic pronouns, such small words can come before the verb, which is the typical formation, or be attached to infinitives, gerunds, and conjugated verbs, like in the imperative. This idea is a vital structure in the language, and it's something to get used to. A different feature that Italian has is the emphasis on reordering elements without changing meaning. Because verb endings show grammatical roles, Italian can reorder components for emphasis. So word order is flexible because meaning is carried by verb conjugation and pronouns, not just position. For example, l'ho visto ieri. I saw him yesterday. Ieri l'ho visto. Yesterday, I saw him. The emphasis is on yesterday. L'ho visto ieri. It was I who saw him yesterday. This phrase is a strong emphasis. After learning sentence structure and word order in Italian, you can focus on typical sentence patterns that are more common in speech and writing. This way, the language and its use will be understood a lot faster. So that's how the concepts work in Italian. Italian has many fundamentals that are simple to understand after learning its principles. Basic words and phrases in Italian include question words, personal pronouns, days of the week, months, time words, greetings and farewells, and numbers. Question words in Italian are known as interrogative words that cannot be answered by simply saying yes or no, or in Italian, sì, no. These questions specify the context of a sentence and indicate how the receiver of a question should respond. What can be expressed in multiple ways, with colloquial formations. Che cosa, cosa. Which is quale, the singular form, and quali, the plural form. Also, gender doesn't affect these words. Who is chi? When is quando? Where is dove? Why and because can both be expressed using one word, perché, and intonation will tell the difference. How is come, and how much or how many is quanto for masculine singular nouns, quanta for feminine singular nouns, and quanti and quante for plural nouns. When using the words in context, Italian doesn't change the word order because there is no inversion or auxiliary verb like in English. Then, Italian has personal subject pronouns that are mainly used for emphasis because the language drops them due to verb conjugations. Such pronouns are replacements for proper names of people. Io is I. Tu is you, informal. Lei is you, formal. Lui is he. Lei is she. Noi is we. Voi is you all. Loro is you all, formal, and they. As you can see, Italian has many nuances with the pronouns, and we can see the differences in English. 1. There is no pronoun for it. 2. Lei can mean she and formal you, so context and verb conjugations tell the difference. Also, the formal you, lei, is always capitalized, and it's used to show respect when speaking with professionals. 3. Io doesn't need to be capitalized like in English, unless it's the first word in a sentence. 4. Loro can mean they and formal you all, and just like with lei, capitalization, context, and conjugations tell the difference. However, while loro can mean formal you all, it's extremely rare and sounds old-fashioned in Italian speech. Instead of using loro, modern Italian uses lei and voi. Aside from these pronouns in the personal form, Italian can change them when put in the form of object pronouns, possessive pronouns, or any other form. These pronouns indicate the grammatical person, gender, and number of the noun they replace. For now, it's better to show them but not describe them, as they need separate videos for explanation. Then, Italian has the days of the week. Lunedì, martedì, mercoledì, giovedì, venerdì, sabato, domenica. English capitalizes the words, but Italian doesn't, unless it's the first word in a sentence. The first 5 days end in di, which comes from day, but only sabato and domenica change in the plural. Then, Italian has the months. Gennaio, febbraio, marzo, aprile, maggio, giugno, luglio, agosto, settembre, ottobre, novembre, dicembre. Just like with days, months are not capitalized unless they're the first word in a sentence. Then, Italian has common time words like oggi, domani, ieri, adesso, ora, presto, tardi, sempre, mai, spesso, a volte, qualche volta. At the same time, we can see parts of the day. La mattina, il pomeriggio, la sera, la notte. Then, Italian has a lot of useful greetings and farewells. These phrases can be very useful when speaking the language and meeting new people. Common greetings are ciao, salve, buongiorno, buon pomeriggio, buonasera, come stai, come sta. As a note, ciao is used for friends and family. In formal settings, salve is better. Common farewells are ciao, arrivederci, arrivederla, a dopo, a presto, buonanotte. When using such farewells, some things need to be considered, such as ciao, which can mean hi and bye. On the other hand, arrivederci can mean goodbye or literally until we see each other again. The word functions like a standard noun or interjection, while arrivederla with a capital L is a very formal way to say goodbye or until I see you again, showing a lot of respect to a professional, such as sir or ma'am. Finally, Italian has cardinal numbers that are spelled and pronounced like this: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Numbers past 10 are 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Numbers past 20 are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. When combining tense numbers with ones numbers, the spelling will simply join the two in any tense number, except for uno and otto with 20. Those numbers will drop E from 20. 21, 28. The rest will have basic spellings. Numbers 100 and beyond are 100, 1000, mila for plural, and 1.000.000. At last, Italian has ordinal numbers that function like adjectives, so they agree in gender and number with the noun they describe. Primo, prima. Secondo, seconda. Terzo, terza. Quarto, quarta. Quinto, quinta. Sesto, sesta. Settimo, settima. Ottavo, ottava. Nono, nona. Decimo, decima. Listing numbers past decimo, decima is too excessive because many of them will simply replace the last vowel with esimo, esima, with little spelling changes. Overall, these are basic words, phrases, and fundamentals in Italian. Verb conjugation in Italian is the modification of a verb's form that expresses facts, repeated actions, and a list of actions. The present tense is one of the easiest tenses in Italian because it has a simple conjugation pattern. However, the language has a progressive tense with gerunds, similar to ing in English. This concept needs to be shown a bit later, after understanding basic verb conjugation. To conjugate verbs in the present, we first have to understand how to identify Italian verbs, such as who is doing the action and when the action happens. For now, we'll focus on the conjugation of regular verbs in the present. Although Italian has irregular verbs too, those will be shown separately in the next video. So, Italian verbs always have an infinitive ending that falls into three categories: are, ere, ire. Common verbs that fall into each category can be amare, parlare, studiare, credere, vedere, prendere, sentire, aprire, dormire. These words are infinitives, the basic form of verbs without conjugation in any tense, and each category has its own patterns. The best way to recognize them is to see the time change in a sentence, which combines with the personal pronouns io, tu, lui, lei, noi, voi, loro. Let's begin with are verbs. The present conjugation pattern for such verbs goes as follows. We get the verb stem by dropping the ending are from the infinitive. Then we add endings to the stem that correspond to the category of the verb. Since we're beginning with are verbs, let's use the verb parlare, to speak. To conjugate parlare in the present, we drop the endings, get the verb stems, and add the endings that match the category. For io, add o. For tu, add i. For lui, lei, add a. For noi, add iamo. For voi, add ate. For loro, add ano. Io parlo. Tu parli. Lui, lei parla. Noi parliamo. Voi parlate. Loro parlano. These are the endings for regular are verbs in the present in Italian. And remember that the language often drops the pronouns because verb conjugation is sufficient in telling who the subject is. Let's move on to ere verbs, like credere, to believe. The conjugation pattern for ere verbs in the present is similar, where we get the verb stems by dropping endings and adding the corresponding endings to the category of the verb. For such verbs, some endings are borrowed from are verbs, but the difference is in lui, lei, voi, and loro. They use e, ete, and ono, while the rest of the endings are borrowed. Io credo. Tu credi. Lui, lei crede. Noi crediamo. Voi credete. Loro credono. These are the endings for regular ere verbs in the present in Italian. Let's finish with ire verbs, like dormire, to sleep. The conjugation pattern for ire verbs in the present is also similar, where we get the verb stems by dropping endings and adding corresponding endings to the category of the verb. For such verbs, many endings are borrowed from ere verbs, with the only change in voi, which uses ite. Io dormo. Tu dormi. Lui, lei dorme. Noi dormiamo. Voi dormite. Loro dormono. These are the endings for regular ire verbs in the present in Italian. However, there's a special subcategory of ire verbs that adds more letters. Although I said that irregular verbs are for the next video, this subcategory is not really irregular because its conjugations are the same as any ire verb. The change happens when the second to last syllable of the infinitive is stressed, like in the verbs capire, finire, preferire, pulire, spedire. Such verbs tend to add I, esse, ci in io, tu, lui, lei, and loro, but not in noi, voi. Capisco, capisci, capisce, capiamo, capite, capiscono. After learning this subcategory, you can now fully understand how regular present verb conjugation works in Italian. It simply follows endings that correspond to each verb type, made from stems and verb endings. Once you memorize these patterns, you can conjugate many regular verbs correctly and speak Italian using simple, everyday phrases like Io studio l'italiano. Tu capisci bene. Lei parla lentamente. Noi dormiamo poco. Loro finiscono il lavoro. Don't forget that these sentences can be said without the subject pronoun, which is a practical way to speak Italian. Overall, this is how the concept works in the language. Irregular present verb conjugation in Italian doesn't follow one fixed pattern. Instead, many irregular Italian verbs have their own special conjugation, which means that such verbs must be memorized, because other patterns for them might not be predictable. In my previous video, I explained regular Italian verb conjugation in the present, showing verb stems and their endings. In this video, I'll explain irregular present verb conjugation, which may follow the same endings, but with different changes in verb stems. Although many verbs in Italian are irregular, some have stem patterns. Of course, knowing all irregular verbs is impossible, so in this video, I will simply show the most common verbs and their patterns, along with some examples in the end. Let's begin with avere, to have. This verb has irregular conjugations that must be remembered, but many of its endings follow the category of ere verbs. Io ho. Tu hai. Lui, lei ha. Noi abbiamo. Voi avete. Loro hanno. What makes avere special is that it has more uses than English, which apply to possession, feelings, and conditions that are idiomatic. If in English we use to be to express ideas like hunger, and age, in Italian we rely on avere, along with other simple phrases. Ho fame. Ho 22 anni. Ho un cane. At the same time, avere can be used as an auxiliary verb for past tenses, but this concept needs to be shown separately. After avere, we can see the verbs fare, andare, dare. What these verbs have in common is that they originate from Latin irregularity, where they share double enne in the loro pronoun. In a verb like fare, to do or to make, the root itself changes, but the endings are regular. Io faccio. Tu fai. Lui, lei fa. Noi facciamo. Voi fate. Loro fanno. In the verb andare, to go, the pattern will have the root va, except for noi and voi. Io vado. Tu vai. Lui, lei va. Noi andiamo. Voi andate. Loro vanno. The verb dare, to give, has a similar pattern. Io do. Tu dai. Lui, lei dà. Noi diamo. Voi date. Loro danno. After learning about these verbs, we can see verbs like venire and tenere, and they are irregular because they add a consonant G or V in some forms, specifically in io, tu, lui, lei, loro. Also, they add G or sometimes gni to io and loro, and modify the stem to ien in tu, lui, lei. That's a lot of information, but that's how the verbs get conjugated in the present, such as venire, to come. Io vengo. Tu vieni. Lui, lei viene. Noi veniamo. Voi venite. Loro vengono. The verb tenere also has the same pattern. Io tengo. Tu tieni. Lui, lei tiene. Noi teniamo. Voi tenete. Loro tengono. Interestingly, Italian has other verbs that follow the same patterns. It's not necessary to show their conjugations, but you will also find them in Italian. Mantenere, ottenere, contenere, appartenere. Other irregular verbs in Italian are uscire and dire. These verbs are irregular because they have highly unconventional stems. Uscire uses e, esse, ci as a stem for io, tu, lui, lei, loro, while remaining regular for noi, voi. Io esco. Tu esci. Lui, lei esce. Noi usciamo. Voi uscite. Loro escono. On the other hand, the verb dire will have a stem of di, I, ci, also in io, tu, lui, lei, noi, loro, while remaining regular for voi. Io dico. Tu dici. Lui, lei dice. Noi diciamo. Voi dite. Loro dicono. At last, Italian modal verbs are also irregular because their stems change, adding consonants and vowels, while their endings remain regular. We can see the verb potere, can or be able to. Io posso. Tu puoi. Lui, lei può. Noi possiamo. Voi potete. Loro possono. Potere is highly irregular because of the addition of esse, along with vowel changes, but it's not the only pattern you'll see. In a verb like volere, to want, li is added. Io voglio. Tu vuoi. Lui, lei vuole. Noi vogliamo. Voi volete. Loro vogliono. Still, in a verb like dovere, must, or have to, most patterns change. Io devo. Tu devi. Lui, lei deve. Noi dobbiamo. Voi dovete. Loro devono. Considering this pattern, we can also see it with the verb bere, to drink, even though it's not modal. Io bevo. Tu bevi. Lui, lei beve. Noi beviamo. Voi bevete. Loro bevono. The pattern here is to memorize the stem bev and not ber in the present. In conclusion, these are the general patterns for irregular present verb conjugation in Italian. After learning the most common verbs, you will be able to handle 90% of everyday Italian speech. As I said in the beginning, knowing all irregular verbs is not necessary because you will not use them all, so instead, focus on the commonly used ones. Nonetheless, two important verbs remain in the language that I did not show, which are irregular, and they both mean to be. Essere, stare. The reason I didn't show these verbs is that they require specific explanations in their own topic, which I will do in the next video. To finish this video, we can see some useful sentences using different irregular verbs, especially with no subject pronouns. Vado al lavoro alle 8. Vieni con me? Posso aiutarti? Voglio imparare l'italiano. Escono spesso la sera. Overall, this is how irregular verbs fully work in the present in Italian. In Italian, the verb to be is not one verb, but two, essere and stare. The difference between them is conceptual and grammatical, and in this video, we'll see how they work in Italian in the present tense. In general, while essere establishes identity, definition, and what something is factually, stare describes a temporary condition or state. This distinction is fundamental to sounding natural in Italian, thereby creating a difference between something permanent and temporary. We can begin with essere, the primary verb for to be. In the present, the verb has irregular conjugations, and they must be memorized. Io sono. Tu sei. Lui, lei è. Noi siamo. Voi siete. Loro sono. Io and loro have the same conjugation, so context will show the difference. Now that we know the conjugations, we can focus on the core uses of essere, starting with identity and definition. Essere defines what something or someone is factually, including professions, roles, and categories. Sono studente. Roma è una città antica. Because the verb explains something permanent, it also defines inherent characteristics like nationality, origin, religion, time, date, events, and possession. Lei è intelligente. Il cielo è blu. Sono americano. Siamo di Milano. È tardi. Oggi è lunedì. È Natale. Il libro è di Maria. At last, essere can also be used as an auxiliary verb to form compound tenses, especially with reflexive verbs and verbs of movement. This topic needs a lot of explanation in a separate video, so in this video, I'll show one example. Sono arrivato. I arrived. Now, we can see the verb stare, which means to be and to stay. Its conjugations in the present are also irregular, but more predictable. Io sto. Tu stai. Lui, lei sta. Noi stiamo. Voi state. Loro stanno. Unlike essere, stare is mainly emphatic in showing temporary states or conditions. This means that the verb can describe physical or emotional states that can change over time. and specifically, it emphasizes something that a person may feel in the moment. For example, sto bene. I'm well right now, but my state may change. Sta male. He or she feels sick right now, but it may change. To further understand the function of the verb, we can compare it with essere. Sono nervoso. Sto nervoso. Both sentences are correct, but they're used in different contexts. By saying sono nervoso, we indicate that I am a nervous person in general, so it's a trait that I possess. It's a more permanent characteristic than a current condition. However, by saying sto nervoso, which is more accurate, we indicate a temporary state and a momentary emotion that I feel now, but it can change. This is the main difference between the verbs. Essere indicates something permanent, which is a trait, and stare is about something temporary, which is a momentary state happening right now. Considering this difference, it explains why stare can be used to indicate location, especially something situational. Sto a casa. Stiamo qui. Still, essere can also indicate location, like from where someone is, but stare emphasizes presence and staying in a temporary condition. To make sure that we fully understand this concept, we can compare the verbs with adjectives, which is where nuance matters most. As you can see in the chart, using essere with adjectives gives a meaning to a person in general, but using stare indicates temporary conditions. Aside from adjectives, another very important function of stare is in the progressive tense. Italian uses stare to express an action in progress, which is equivalent to using to be plus a gerund plus ing in English. In Italian, there is a similar structure that uses stare because the progressive state is something temporary, and that's why stare is used along with a gerund that ends in ando or endo. The ending ando is used with are verbs, while endo is used with ere and ire verbs. To form a gerund, we simply remove the infinitive ending and add the gerund endings. Sto studiando. Stai lavorando? Stanno mangiando. As a note, Italian often prefers the simple present, where English uses the progressive, because the tense is more specific in Italian. Overall, this is how the verb to be fully works in Italian. Essere mainly describes permanent traits, while stare explains temporary states. Negation in Italian changes the meaning of a phrase to show an absence, contradiction, or denial. Negation nullifies words and sentences and shows they're false by adding a negative. In Italian, negation is systematic and simple, using the word non, which is equivalent to the English not. The basic rule is that non always goes directly before conjugated verbs, which applies to all tenses, all moods, and regular and irregular verbs, like in the following phrases. Mangio, non mangio. È vero, non è vero. When it comes to compound tenses, it's a topic that needs a separate video, but in this video, negation will be simple, because non comes before auxiliary verbs. Ho capito. Non ho capito. When negating an infinitive, gerund, or participle, non comes directly before them. Mangiare. Non mangiare. In common contexts, we can see sentences like voglio mangiare, non voglio mangiare, non fumare. A key rule to remember is that Italian requires double negation when negative words appear together. This is different from English because Italian is more grammatical, having common negative words that you can see in this chart, along with two negative structures. if the negative word comes after the verb, we have to keep non. Non vedo niente. Non mangio più carne. However, non will drop if the negative word comes before the verb, like niente funziona, nessuno è arrivato, mai dire mai. When it comes to questions, Italian does not change word order to form negative questions because intonation is sufficient. Vai a casa? Non vai a casa? When object pronouns are involved, non still comes before the verb. Lo so. Non lo so. At last, Italian can make a distinction between total negation and partial negation, like non capisco niente. Still, limited negation can be said using special negative phrases, like non capisco tutto. Non è sempre facile. Even so, spoken Italian often reinforces negation for emphasis, which is known as colloquial negation. Non ho visto niente, proprio niente. Non me ne importa niente. You can also hear mica, even though it's informal, but common. Non è mica vero. Overall, this is how negation fully works in Italian. Remember to place non correctly along with double negation and special negative words. Descriptive adjectives in Italian describe qualities, states, physical traits, and personality. Most of the time, they're placed after the noun that they describe, but they all must agree in gender and number, whether it's masculine, feminine, singular, or plural. We can begin with gender agreement using the endings of adjectives. Adjectives that have typical endings follow the same pattern as many nouns. Let's use the adjective bello, beautiful. Il ragazzo bello. I ragazzi belli. La casa bella. Le case belle. In general, this is the pattern for adjective endings, and we can see the same thing with adjectives that have a in the masculine singular form. Let's use the adjective entusiasta, enthusiastic. Un ragazzo entusiasta. Una ragazza entusiasta. Ragazzi entusiasti. Ragazze entusiaste. At the same time, some adjectives end in e, and these are gender invariant in the singular form. A common adjective is interessante, interesting. Un libro interessante. Una storia interessante. Libri interessanti. Storie interessanti. Considering these points, the key rule to remember is that adjectives always agree with the noun, not with the meaning. And even if the adjective is far from the noun, agreement is still necessary. Some examples are: Il gruppo è grande. Le persone sono stanche. Nonetheless, the position of adjectives matters because Italian is more subtle and stylistic. The general position is to place adjectives after nouns, describing literal meaning and distinguishing information. However, some adjectives can come before the noun, especially when expressing subjective impressions, familiar qualities, and emphasis or emotional tone. Common adjectives that precede nouns are bello, brutto, buono, cattivo, grande, piccolo, nuovo, vecchio, giovane, caro. Some examples are una bella giornata, un vecchio amico. Despite this rule, it's important to consider that some adjectives can change meaning depending on placement, as you can see in this chart. For example, if grande comes before a noun, it would mean great or important, but if it's placed after a noun, it simply means big. This concept applies to all of these adjectives, and we can see the distinction in these phrases. Un grande uomo, a great man. Un uomo grande, a big man. Un vecchio amico, longtime friend. Un amico vecchio, elderly friend. Moreover, when adjectives follow the verbs essere and stare, they must agree with the subject, but the meaning can change depending on the verb, like saying è nervoso, he's a nervous person. Sta nervoso, he's nervous now. We know that the subject is he without the pronoun because the ending of the adjective indicates that. Also, the topic of essere and stare is something I showed in a previous video, which I recommend watching to understand this idea. Furthermore, if an adjective refers to multiple nouns, the number will typically take over. If a sentence has mixed genders, the masculine plural will be used, but if it's all feminine, the feminine plural is used. Un ragazzo e una ragazza intelligenti. Una casa e una strada strette. Even so, some adjectives can stand alone when the noun is implied. An agreement still applies. Il rosso, the red one. I giovani, young people. La bella, the beautiful woman. At last, adjectives can also be modified by intensifiers, and these words do not change unless they are adjectives themselves. Molto, very. Troppo, too. Abbastanza, quite. Poco, a little. Una casa molto grande. Sono troppo stanchi. Overall, this is how descriptive adjectives work in Italian, considering agreement of gender and number in position that can change meaning. Possessive adjectives in Italian modify a noun, and possessive pronouns replace a noun. In the language, such concepts require a definite article in places where English doesn't have one. In English, the words indicate possession, ownership, and what belongs to whom, and in Italian, the concepts show the same thing. However, Italian possessives must agree with the noun being possessed, and not with the owner. This is a big difference from English, because agreement says that the possessive must agree in gender and number with the noun. The structure of using possessives in itself is made from a definite article, a possessive, and a noun. But before we show examples, we can see what possessive adjectives look like in Italian. Keep in mind that all of these mean my, your, his, her, our, your plural, and their, just being affected by gender and number. Considering how the words have to agree, it's also important to use the correct definite article based on gender and number, which is something I showed in a previous video. Masculine singular adjectives are mio, tuo, suo, nostro, vostro, loro. Feminine singular adjectives are mia, tua, sua, nostra, vostra, loro. Masculine plural adjectives are miei, tuoi, suoi, nostri, vostri, loro. Feminine plural adjectives are mie, tue, sue, nostre, vostre, loro. Generally, the words all share the same form, just with different endings, except for loro, which is always the same, so the article will show the difference. The best way to remember these words is to know the universal endings, which you will see in many Italian concepts. O means masculine and singular. A means feminine and singular. E means masculine and plural. And E means feminine and plural. In general, this is what possessive adjectives look like in Italian, and now we can see some examples using definite articles, adjectives, and nouns. Il mio libro. La mia casa. il mio amico, la sua macchina, i nostri genitori. Considering the use of the definite article, this is something that's almost always required in Italian. It's not possible to say mio libro, so we have to say il mio libro, my book. However, there is a major exception to this rule, and it relates to singular family members. When referring to singular, unmodified family terms, the definite article is dropped, such as saying mia madre, tuo fratello, nostra nonna. Nonetheless, the definite article is needed if the family noun is plural, if the noun is modified, and if you use loro. I miei fratelli, la mia cara madre, la loro madre. After learning about possessive adjectives, we can now see possessive pronouns, which replace nouns, just like saying mine, yours, his, hers, ours, and theirs in English. To form possessive pronouns, we use the same words as before, so the writing is simply borrowed. However, we still have to use definite articles, and although the form is the same, the function is different. When using possessive pronouns in context, the pattern will have a definite article and a possessive pronoun that shows ownership and replaces a noun to avoid repetition. This means that it can stand alone in a sentence and clarify who owns something. Some examples are: questo libro è il mio, la casa è la nostra. Even so, we can compare adjectives and pronouns side by side. In this case, the adjective modifies libro, while the pronoun replaces it. Furthermore, Italian has a special case with loro, which means their. Loro never changes for gender or number, thereby allowing us to make any sentence, like il loro cane, le loro case, la loro macchina, i loro amici. Even though gender and number do not affect, loro, the definite article, still must agree with the noun. At last, it's good to know that Italian can use possessives for contrast, even when English doesn't, and this concept adds emphasis. If you want to make a distinction, you can say something like ognuno ha la sua opinione. Everyone has their own opinion. Faccio il mio lavoro. I do my job. Overall, this is how possessive adjectives and pronouns fully work in Italian. The concepts require definite articles, they must agree with the noun and not the owner, and family terms have special rules. Demonstrative adjectives in Italian are words that point out specific things or people. In English, these are this, these, referring to something close, and that, those, referring to something far. In Italian, such words must agree in gender, masculine or feminine, and number, singular or plural, with the noun they modify, and they always go before it. Generally, Italian has two main demonstrative systems, as you can see in this chart. Questo, questa, questi, queste. Quello, quella, quelli, quelle. When using demonstratives, the adjective must agree in gender and number, such as saying questa casa, questi libri. But it's important to understand the concept of distance when using such words. Questo means this, referring to something close or something happening now. Some examples are: questo libro è interessante. Queste scarpe sono nuove. In questo momento. On the other hand, quello means that, referring to something further away. An example can be quella casa è vecchia. Moreover, it's important to mention that quello behaves like a definite article, so it can change form like il, lo, la, i, li, le. The system of how to modify articles is something I showed when I explained gender, articles, and pluralization in Italian, so I highly recommend watching that video to understand this idea. Although it looks like a lot of information, knowing noun types and articles is what matters most. After some practice, you will understand how quello is affected and when to use it. At the same time, the demonstrative questo can also contract, but it does so more simply. Questo will change to quest before vowels, and it applies to both genders, like saying quest'amico, quest'idea. However, plural forms do not contract, so we keep them as they are. Questi amici, queste idee. At last, you should know that sometimes in regional and advanced Italian, you may see codesto, meaning near you. However, it's rare, mostly Tuscan, and often sounds formal and literary. For this lesson, I will not explain it, because native speakers mainly use questo and quello, but it's something interesting to know. Overall, this is how demonstrative adjectives fully work in Italian. They agree with the noun and are always placed before it. Italian comparatives are used to compare two people, things, or actions, and Italian has three main types of comparatives: majority, more than; minority, less than; and equality, as much as. In English, the formation of comparatives has an intensifier and a conjunction for long adjectives, but short adjectives receive more letters. In Italian, this structure is similar, but with no additional letters, so the pattern will always use an intensifier. To make a comparison of a majority, the formation will use più, meaning more, plus an adjective, adverb, or noun, plus di, che, which are the conjunctions. The distinction between them is important because we use di when comparing two nouns, pronouns, or numbers. But we use che when comparing two adjectives, two verbs, or two prepositions, as you can see in the charts. Here we can see the use of di. Maria è più alta di Luca. È più interessante di quello. Più di 3 persone. Here we can see the use of che. È più simpatico che intelligente. Mangio più che bevo. Vengo da Roma più che da Milano. This is how we make a comparison of a majority. Now, let's see how to make a comparison of a minority using meno, meaning less, plus an adjective, adverb, or noun, plus di, che. Here, the rule for di, che is the same, so we can see some sentences like studio meno italiano che spagnolo. Lui parla meno chiaramente di lei. At last, let's see how to make a comparison of equality, and here, Italian has multiple ways. The language uses così, come, or tanto, quanto. Così, come is used with adjectives and adverbs, while tanto, quanto is used with nouns. Also, this pattern must agree in gender and number with the noun to make an equal comparison, as we can see in the following sentences. Marco è così alto come suo fratello. Parli così bene come un madrelingua. Ho tanti libri quanti quaderni. Now that we've seen how to form comparatives, we can analyze superlatives. And in Italian, there is a distinction between two types: a relative superlative, meaning the most or the least, and an absolute superlative, meaning very or extremely. While English adds letters to short adjectives and uses an intensifier for longer adjectives, Italian has a different pattern. A relative superlative is used when comparing something within a group, which is equivalent to the English most or least. The formation has a definite article plus più or meno plus an adjective plus di, tra, or fra. As a note, di means of, and tra and fra are interchangeable synonyms meaning between, among, or in, depending on context. Although it's a long formation, it's quite simple to understand because intensifiers will always be used. Some examples are: È la città più bella d'Italia. Questo è il libro meno interessante della lista. Maria è la più giovane tra le sorelle. Moreover, an absolute superlative is used without comparison to others, and there are two ways to make it. The first way is to use molto, affected by gender and number, plus an adjective, which is common in Italian speech. Some examples are: Questo film è molto bello. Sono molto stanco oggi. The second way is to use the suffix issimo, which is also affected by gender and number, but this method is more expressive. The formation will remove the final vowel from an adjective which will agree in gender and number, adding issimo in the end. If this sounds too hard, we can simplify the pattern in this chart, having base adjectives with their absolute superlatives. Bello, bellissimo. Grande, grandissimo. Felice, felicissimo. Difficile, difficilissimo. When using absolute superlatives, they often imply emotion, emphasis, and style, like saying, È una città bellissima. Sono felicissimo di vederti. After knowing how to form Italian comparatives and superlatives, the last thing you need to know is that some adjectives have irregular forms, which are taken from Latin. This is similar to English, where some words completely change form to sound better, like good, better, best, bad, worse, worst. In Italian, there are more irregularities, but they have predictable endings. On the left, the adjectives are in their basic form: buono, cattivo, grande, piccolo, alto, basso. In the middle, the comparatives are irregular: migliore, peggiore, maggiore, minore, superiore, inferiore. On the right, the superlatives are also irregular: ottimo, pessimo, massimo, minimo, supremo, infimo. Considering such irregular words, we can use them in context and say things like Questo vino è migliore di quello. È la peggiore esperienza della mia vita. Abita al piano superiore. As a note, it's useful to know that regular forms can also be used in everyday Italian speech, such as saying più buono, più grande. This is done when the meaning is literal than abstract, so instead of using irregular adjectives, you can always use intensifiers. Overall, this is how comparatives and superlatives fully work in Italian, and as a way to conclude this lesson, you can see and write down the key takeaways from all the concepts. Personal object pronouns in Italian replace nouns that function as the object of a verb. Instead of repeating a noun, we replace it with a pronoun. We can begin with direct object pronouns, which replace the direct object of a verb, that is, the person or thing that receives the action directly. Direct object pronouns also answer the questions what or whom. And in English, we can have a simple phrase like I eat an apple. I eat it. The direct object is apple, and its pronoun is it. Such pronouns in English are me you, him, her, us, and them. But in Italian, their forms will be different, being affected by gender and number. Mi, ti, lo, la, ci, vi, li, le. The word vi is the direct object pronoun for you all or y'all, and even though English doesn't have it, I will still include it. While some pronouns are understandable, others are affected by gender and number. Lo can mean singular masculine it or him. La can be singular feminine it or her. Li can be plural masculine them, as in people or things, and le can mean plural feminine them. So, this is what direct object pronouns look like in Italian, and now we can see how to use them. First, we need to understand their placement. The most common placement for them is before a conjugated verb, and we can see them in order in basic phrases. Mi vedi, ti chiamo, lo mangio, la leggo, ci ascolta, vi invito, li vedo, le compro. This method is the most common, but at the same time, such pronouns can be attached to infinitives and gerunds. And here, we have more rules. Considering placement, this is where the concept can be tricky, because generally, it's common to place pronouns before verbs, but it's important to see the other forms. If we want to attach a pronoun to an infinitive, we have to drop the final e from the infinitive ending, that is, from are, ere, ire. Then, we attach the pronoun to it, and we can see some examples with pronouns before and after. Voglio mangiare la mela. La voglio mangiare. Voglio mangiarla. Devo leggere il libro. Lo devo leggere. Devo leggerlo. Both placements are grammatically correct, and the attachment sounds natural in spoken Italian. Additionally, we can attach direct object pronouns to gerunds, which express ongoing actions. Italian gerunds end in ando or endo, similar to the English ing. Still, this is another form to consider, because unlike infinitives, we do not drop anything. We can attach pronouns as they are, but they can never go before the gerund. This concept is more advanced, and if it sounds too confusing, it's best to practice with pronouns before the verb. Otherwise, we can learn every possible placement of pronouns, which is most common in the progressive tense that uses the verb stare, to be. This construction behaves like a single verbal unit, but pronoun placement is flexible. We can see this formation in comparison to the basic form. Sto leggendo il libro. Lo sto leggendo. Sto leggendolo. This attachment is very common in Italian speech. At last, one other concept has to be known, and it relates to the compound past, which will be explained in detail in a separate video. Here, I will simply show one rule. With the Italian present perfect, past participles must agree with direct object pronouns, and this agreement happens only with them. An example can be Ho mangiato le mele. Le ho mangiate. The participle agrees in gender and number with the pronoun, but again, this concept is for a separate video. Now, let's see indirect object pronouns which replace the person to whom or for whom something is done, thereby answering such questions. In English, an example is I give the book to Adam. I give him the book, or I give the book to him. In this case, there's a direct object with an indirect object, so him is the indirect object pronoun. Such pronouns in English borrow the same form, but most of the time, they're specified in context with the preposition to or for. In Italian, the forms are also borrowed, but some change. mi, ti, li, ci, vi, li. Such pronouns don't just mean me, you, him. They mean to me, to you, to him, basically indicating to whom. Even so, to him, to her, and to them have the same pronoun, li, be it masculine or feminine, so context will show the difference in gender and number. As a note, this pronoun also has a traditional form, le, but is less common in speech. So, this is what indirect object pronouns look like in Italian, and now we can see how to use them. The good thing is that placement rules of indirect object pronouns are the same as those of direct pronouns. The most common placement is before a conjugated verb, and we can see them in order in basic phrases. Mi parla, ti scrivo, gli do il libro, ci manda un messaggio, vi spiego la lezione, gli porto il regalo. Notice how some examples also have direct objects, because typically the two types of pronouns work together in context. Placing such pronouns before verbs is the most common method, but at the same time, they work with infinitives the same way. To attach an indirect object pronoun to an infinitive, drop the final e from it and then attach the pronoun. We can see some examples with pronouns before and after. Voglio parlare a Maria. Voglio parlargli. Devo scrivere a Luca. Devo scrivergli. Posso dare il regalo a loro. Posso dargli il regalo. Furthermore, we can attach indirect object pronouns to gerunds, which again is a tricky but practical concept. The most common use is again the progressive tense that uses the verb stare, to be, as we can see in comparison to the basic form. Scrivendo a Luca ho risolto tutto. Scrivendogli ho risolto tutto. At last, indirect object pronouns do not affect past participles, so there is no need to show this concept. The last thing to consider in this lesson is double object pronouns that combine indirect pronouns with direct pronouns. At this point, the concept can become difficult to understand because Italian changes the form of the pronouns when combined. It's important to understand that when combining pronouns, indirect ones will come first, and then direct ones. This combination will cause indirect object pronouns to change form, and more specifically, mi, ti, ci, vi, li change form to me, te, ce, ve, lie. Once again, when combining such words, indirect pronouns take these forms, and then we add direct pronouns. Nonetheless, considering the use of this grammar, it would not make sense to repeat certain pronouns, like mi, ti, ci, and vi. As a result, when using indirect pronouns with direct ones, the only logical pronouns to use are lo, la, li, and le. However, another rule comes into play. When combining third-person forms with lo, la, li, le, Italian will join them into single words. Liello, liella, lielli, lielle. Other indirect pronouns simply change the e to e, but they will not be joined as single words. This rule applies only to third-person pronouns, because indirect pronouns come first. Another thing to consider is the pronoun ne, which is a versatile pronoun meaning of it or of them, or about it, about them. This pronoun is special because it replaces phrases with prepositions to avoid repetition, so it serves as a partitive construction, allowing a more natural speech and often translating to some, of them, about it, from there. If again it sounds too confusing, the meaning will be simple in context. So, this is what combined object pronouns look like in Italian, and now we can see how to use them. Just like previous concepts, double object pronouns go before conjugated verbs, but the indirect pronoun will go first, like in the following sentences. Me lo dice. Te la mando. Glielo do. Ce li mostra. Ve le spiego. Gliele porto. Placing combined pronouns before verbs is again the most common way, and as always, it's possible to attach them to infinitives and gerunds. When infinitives are combined with them, the indirect pronoun will go first, and the final e is removed from the infinitive. Voglio dare il libro a Maria. Voglio darglielo. Preferisco mandare le foto a Luca. Preferisco mandargliele. This formation is very common in spoken Italian. Lastly, when gerunds are combined with multiple pronouns, the form stays the same as with previous concepts, but this is more compact. Sto dando il libro a Maria. Sto dandoglielo. Considering past participles as the final point, if a direct object pronoun is involved, the past participle will agree in gender and number. But once again, this is for a separate video. For this lesson, we've seen a lot of complex ways to use direct and indirect object pronouns in Italian, and in the end, we can see the key takeaways and write them down. Direct pronouns replace what and whom. Indirect pronouns replace to whom and for whom. Combined pronouns change form, and their order matters. Also, don't forget about infinitives and gerunds, where attaching pronouns to them is a possibility. In conclusion, Italian object pronouns can feel very hard because they're compact and flexible, but once you understand what's being replaced, the system will become predictable and simple. Reflexive verbs in Italian describe an action that reflects back onto the subject, so they are verbs where the subject and object are the same person. In English, this is often expressed with self or selves, but in Italian, reflexivity is shown with reflexive pronouns. Such examples can be mi lavo, I wash myself. Si veste, he or she gets dressed. In general, reflexive pronouns come before the verb, so it's crucial to know when to use them and what they look like. In my previous video, I showed object pronouns, but here the forms are borrowed, except si, with a different function. Mi is the reflexive pronoun for the subject io. Ti is the pronoun for tu, and so on. Ci, vi, si. Notice how si is used for lui, lei, and loro, so it's simply borrowed, and context and verb conjugation will show the difference. This is what reflexive pronouns look like in Italian, but it's important to understand how to identify reflexive verbs in their infinitive forms. As such, we'll find that they end in si, but it's not a suffix that you conjugate. Instead, it's replaced with the corresponding pronoun that will match the subject. In this case, we can see the non-reflexive verbs with their reflexive infinitives. Lavare means to wash. Vestire means to dress. Svegliare means to wake someone. On the other hand, lavarsi means to wash oneself. Vestirsi means to get dressed. Svegliarsi means to wake up. As you can see, we identify Italian reflexive infinitives by the ending si. In English, however, such verbs can have a presence of multiple words, but in either case, the person doing the action is the same person receiving it. Specifically, there is a big difference between dress and get dressed. To get dressed means to put on your clothes, as in getting dressed yourself, while to dress often implies formality or is used when helping something or someone else. This is the difference between regular verbs and reflexive ones. To conjugate Italian reflexive verbs in the present tense, we follow a step-by-step method. First, we remove the ending si. Second, we conjugate the verb correctly for each subject. In the end, we add the reflexive pronoun before the verb, like in the verb lavarsi, to wash oneself. Mi lavo, ti lavi, si lava, ci laviamo, vi lavate, si lavano. Because Italian is more specific, it's not necessary to say the subjects, because reflexive pronouns already indicate that. This pattern of placing the pronoun before the verb is the same in all tenses. So, this is how we conjugate reflexive verbs, and in spoken Italian, it's very common to use them in daily routines and mental states, using frequent verbs. Svegliarsi, alzarsi, lavarsi, vestirsi, pettinarsi, divertirsi, annoiarsi. Generally, reflexive verbs are essential in Italian, and one of the most important reasons to learn them carefully is that some can change meaning when they become reflexive, like svegliarsi, to wake up, fermarsi, to stop oneself, ricordarsi, to remember, perdersi, to get lost. You can see the difference that's made when regular verbs become reflexive, so it's very important to know. Moreover, a different rule in Italian relates to compound tenses, where reflexive verbs always use essere as the auxiliary, so past participles must agree with the subject. This concept is more advanced and requires a different video, but in this video, I'm simply mentioning this rule. Essere, to be, can be an auxiliary verb that works with reflexive verbs and verbs of movement, so when it's used with past participles, they must agree with the subject. Thus, they give more information about the subject in context, such as saying, mi sono lavato, I washed myself, masculine. We know the subject is io because of the pronoun, and that it's masculine because the participle ends in o. On the other hand, mi sono lavata means that the subject is feminine because it ends in a. As I said, this concept needs a separate video. Furthermore, the placement of reflexive pronouns matters because they can go before conjugated verbs, like we've seen previously, but they can also be attached to infinitives and gerunds. As such, reflexive pronouns can attach to infinitives and drop the final vowel, but when they attach to gerunds, nothing is dropped. An example of both concepts is voglio alzarmi presto. I want to get up early. Sto alzandomi presto. I am getting up early. According to the rule, both forms are grammatically correct, but it's more common to place reflexive pronouns before the conjugated verb. Mi voglio alzare presto. Mi sto alzando presto. The difference is that putting pronouns before verbs is the natural way to use reflexive verbs. Lastly, we should know that some reflexive verbs can also be reciprocal, showing actions that are done to each other. Such verbs are mainly used in social actions, having two or more subjects, like the verbs incontrarsi, to meet each other, salutarsi, to greet each other, abbracciarsi, to hug each other. When using reciprocal reflexives, context typically makes the meaning clear, as we can see in these examples. Ci incontriamo al bar ogni venerdì. Si salutano sempre con un sorriso. Ci abbracciamo prima di partire. These are classical reciprocal reflexives, where the action goes from the subject back to it collectively. Ultimately, Italian can use reflexive verbs in places where English doesn't, so they're more common in the language. Expressions like mi ricordo, mi sento bene, si lamenta do not translate word for word because their function is different, so we have to watch out for such verbs. Overall, this is how reflexive verbs fully work in Italian. They express daily routines, indicate actions that are done to oneself, and create nuance with minimal structure. Once you master them, the concept will be simple and more idiomatic to use, and your Italian will sound better. There are two verbs for the verb to know in Italian. Sapere, conoscere. Sapere means to know factual information and how to do something, while conoscere means to know a person, place, or thing, essentially being familiar with an idea. The core difference between the two verbs matters, because using the verbs in everyday speech will make your Italian sound natural and precise. Before using them in context, let's see how to conjugate them, at least in the present tense, starting with sapere, to know factual information. In the present, sapere is an irregular verb that has different patterns, such as double consonants. So, sai, sa, sappiamo, sapete, sanno. Even though the conjugations are irregular, their use is very common, such as saying factual information. So che oggi piove. Sai il suo nome? At the same time, we can use sapere for the knowledge of how to do something, using sapere plus an infinitive in these phrases. So guidare. Sa parlare italiano. As always, it's not necessary to say the subject pronouns, because the conjugations are specific enough. Now, we can see conoscere, which means being familiar with people, places, and ideas. Its conjugations in the present follow regular ere verbs, with some spelling changes. Conosco, conosci, conosce, conosciamo, conoscete, conoscono. As a spelling rule, don't forget that this sound becomes hard when placed before o and a, because the vowels are strong. When it's placed before I and e, the sound becomes sh. Now, we can see how to use conoscere, mainly expressing familiarity. Conosco Maria. Conosci I tuoi vicini? Conosco Roma molto bene. Conosco questo libro. Conosci la cultura italiana? Because the verb is about experience, we cannot use it with an infinitive, and so it's something useful to know. What we've seen so far are the most common uses of the two verbs, but because Italian is more flexible, other concepts are also beneficial and necessary for fully understanding their function. For instance, when comparing their use side by side, we can see the distinction. If I say so l'italiano, I mean that I know Italian in the sense that I fully know the language and its ability. However, if I say conosco l'italiano, it would mean that I'm familiar with Italian usage and context. Both phrases are possible, but the focus is different. Even so, when focusing on the verbs in past tenses, their function becomes very tricky. Because tenses can change meaning, sapere and conoscere make a big difference in time aspects in the past. This concept is more advanced, which I will begin to explain in my next videos. For this video, I will highly emphasize their meanings in the past, but I will not focus on their conjugation, because that requires a different video. For now, we can see how the verbs work in the Italian simple past and imperfect, starting with sapere. The simple past, which has the form of the English present perfect, will change the meaning of sapere to discovering or finding something out. On the other hand, in the imperfect, it would still mean to know. Ho saputo la notizia ieri. Sapevo la verità. This difference shows the change in a state of knowledge, and not just in time. Considering conoscere, the meaning changes even more, with the simple past indicating meeting someone at a moment, while the imperfect signifies an ongoing state of knowing. Ho conosciuto Anna nel 2020. Conoscevo Anna molto bene. Moreover, some expressions with the verbs can be idiomatic, and so they're fixed with one verb. Here, a logical understanding doesn't really help, because the sayings are more colloquial, so it's better to learn them with experience. Sapere a memoria. Non sapere che pesci prendere. Sapere di plus a noun. Conoscere qualcuno di vista. Conoscere i propri limiti. Conoscere il mondo. Furthermore, sapere can be used as a verb that expresses awareness, especially in places where English uses be aware, realize, have heard, although the language hides it more. Examples can be lo so, I know, I'm aware. Non lo sapevo, I didn't realize, I wasn't aware. Sai che? Are you aware that? These phrases are very common in spoken Italian. Overall, this is how the verb to know fully works in Italian. We can think of it in terms of knowledge as an event versus knowledge as a relationship. Sapere means to know something that has entered your mind, while conoscere means to be familiar with or have a relationship with the knowledge you have. Still, the aspect of knowing can change in past tenses, and because it's an advanced concept, I will explain it thoroughly in the next videos. The past tenses in Italian come from Latin, which had a set of synthetic past forms. As spoken Latin evolved into Romance languages, these synthetic forms began to lose clarity in everyday speech. To compensate, speakers started reinforcing past meaning by combining a verb of possession or state, that is, an auxiliary verb, and a verbal adjective, that is, a past participle. This pattern emphasized time and completion with one action, and over time, two auxiliary verbs survived because they served different semantic purposes. The division between the verbs later became part of the grammar, especially in Italian, so in the language, compound past forms became true verb tenses, consisting of auxiliary verbs avere, to have, essere, to be, and past participles. The focus of avere is on performed actions, while essere is about the state or result of an action. When it comes to learning Italian past tenses, many of them have the prossimo form, and its original function is about completed actions that are still connected to the present, thereby making a compound tense form. Even today, Italian compound tenses are dominant in speech. In these lessons, I will explain every Italian past tense individually, along with how to form and when to use each one. In the beginning, it's good to learn the origin of the Italian past tenses so that later auxiliaries and agreements become simple. Let's begin with the simple compound past, known in Italian as passato prossimo. This tense is the most common in Italian speech, which is historically a reinforced past and a compound tense that is tied to completion. Now, it's important to see the core structure of the tense, having two elements: an auxiliary verb, avere, essere, and a past participle. Think of it as the English present perfect, but in Italian, the focus is on completed past actions. We should know that only the auxiliary verb is conjugated for person and number, while the past participle is fixed in form. But there is a major rule that I will show later. Because the auxiliary is conjugated, we have to see the conjugations of avere and essere in the present indicative. These are the conjugations that we will need in the tense. Ho, hai, ha, abbiamo, avete, hanno, sono, sei, è, siamo, siete, sono. As always, we don't need to say the subject pronouns, because the conjugations are sufficient. For now, we know the first element of the passato prossimo, the auxiliary verb. The second element is the past participle, which carries the lexical meaning of the verb. For now, I will show the formation of regular participles so that we can see how to form sentences in this tense. Later, I will explain irregular participles separately. To form Italian past participles, we consider the endings of infinitives. Are, ere, ire. Let's use the verbs parlare, credere, dormire. To make participles out of the verbs, we drop the infinitive endings and add the following endings. Atto for are verbs, utto for ere verbs, and ito for ire verbs. Now we have past participles. Parlato, creduto, dormito. After learning the first element, we now know the second element, which is the past participle. By putting the elements together, we can make simple sentences with other verbs. Ho parlato. Hai mangiato. Ha studiato. Abbiamo letto. Hanno finito. Sono arrivato. Sei partito. È entrata. Siamo tornati. Sono rimaste. These are basic phrases in the passato prossimo. When it comes to translating them, a sentence like ho parlato can mean both I spoke, simple past, and I have spoken, present perfect. In English, the phrases separate depending on context, but Italian has one tense for both concepts, signifying a completed action in the past, whether it was just now or back in time. In these examples, you might have noticed that the participles don't change with avere, but with essere, some modifications happen. This is done so that the words match the subject based on person and number, thereby creating agreement, which I will emphasize later. After learning the main structure of the tense, we can now see irregular participles in agreement. Irregular participles exist in Italian because they come directly from Latin perfect forms and older verbal adjectives. They survived because they belonged to high-frequency verbs, which were not regular. For this reason, there is no specific system for them, so we have to recognize some of their patterns and memorize them. Of course, knowing all irregular participles is impossible, so as a rule of thumb, it's better to see the most commonly used participles whose patterns somewhat help, because they end in to, so, or sto. Once again, there is no fixed pattern for irregular participles, so we simply memorize them. Stato, avuto, fatto, detto, visto, preso, messo, rimasto, venuto, tenuto, dato, scritto, letto, aperto, chiuso, scelto, bevuto, vissuto, morto. After seeing many irregular participles, we now have to understand participle agreement, and this is where Italian highly deviates from English, which can be a difficult concept. An agreement happens between the subject and the past participle, but the key question is which auxiliary verb is affected. Generally, avere is not affected by this rule, so when it's the auxiliary, the past participle never agrees with the subject. Like in this example, Maria ha mangiato. Maria is a feminine singular subject, but the participle mangiato remains unchanged. However, there is a special case that I explained in my object pronoun video in Italian. Agreement can happen with avere only when a direct object pronoun precedes the verb, like saying ho mangiato le mele, le ho mangiate. This agreement happens for a reason, because the pronoun effectively becomes the object's placeholder. This formation changes the agreement focus from the subject to the object, making the participle act like an adjective that modifies it. In essence, it's a grammatical feature reflecting the object's prior placement before the verb, so it creates a connection that requires the participle to match the pronoun's gender and number. This explanation can be tricky to understand, but it's far simpler to comprehend with essere. When essere is the auxiliary, the past participle must agree in gender and number with the subject. Even though it may seem like a lot of rules, historical context can help us see why agreement exists in the first place. When using essere as the auxiliary, Italian past participles agree with the subject. But why? A very important detail that I mentioned in the beginning of the video is that essere is a verb that's about the state or result of an action. Specifically, it's about the change of state of an action, which perfectly explains why essere is used with verbs of movement and reflexive verbs. The purpose of such verbs is to show a change of state, which they all do, and as a result, they make the participle function more like an adjective that describes the subject's state. Grammatically, the state of action is variable, meaning that it can change, and that's why reflexive verbs and verbs of movement are needed with essere. They are about the state of action, showing agreement with the subject in gender and number. On the contrary, this idea is the opposite of avere, because this auxiliary verb is about performed actions. As I said at the beginning, avere emphasizes fixed actions that are invariable, and if they are fixed, there is no need for a participle to agree with the subject, except when direct object pronouns are used. That's why agreement affects essere and not avere, and that's the main difference between the two verbs. Historically, when essere is used, the past participle behaves like an adjective by describing the state of the subject, using verbs that show a change of state. A good example of agreement is in the following chart. Lui è arrivato. Lei è arrivata. Loro sono arrivati. Loro sono arrivate. As we can see, the person and number per sentence are different, using essere and past participles that must agree with the subject. In essence, all of the sentences mean arrived, in the sense that they're all in an arrived state, which is variable. Ultimately, that's why agreement exists with essere. By changing the vowel to match the person and number, we change the participle so that it agrees with the subject, and the same endings apply to any participle. We change the vowel to o, a, I, or e, depending on person and number. After learning the complexity of this topic, we can finish the lesson on the passato prossimo with irregularities in the tense. These concepts may seem like too much, but it's good to know them to fully understand the tense. One concept we should know is that some verbs can take either auxiliary verb, depending on syntactic function, like cambiare, crescere, passare, and finire. This idea is quite irregular in Italian because of transitive verbs that require a direct object to finish the thought and intransitive verbs that do not need anything to express a statement. Essere is used with no direct objects, while avere is needed with direct objects to finish the thought. Another concept is reflexive verbs, which I mentioned before, but here we can see some examples. Reflexive verbs always use essere because they're about a change of state, which is the function of essere. As we know, reflexive pronouns are placed before conjugated verbs, and participles must agree in person and number. Mi sono svegliato. Si sono incontrati. Ci siamo preparate. Another concept is impersonal constructions, where subjects are syntactically empty and the agreement is different. È piovuto. È successo qualcosa. È bastato poco. In such impersonal phrases, the participles stay masculine and singular. Overall, other concepts can be useful in fully understanding the purpose of the passato prossimo, and as a way to conclude the lesson, we can finish with practical examples in all categories of the rules that we've seen. Ho studiato tutta la notte. Abbiamo mangiato bene. Le ragazze hanno parlato molto. Sono arrivato tardi. Maria è partita ieri. I bambini sono tornati a casa. Ho visto il film. Abbiamo fatto un errore. Lei ha detto la verità. Sono venuti a trovarci. È rimasta sola. Mi sono svegliato presto. Si sono incontrati per caso. Ci siamo preparate in fretta. È piovuto tutta la notte. È successo qualcosa di strano. È bastato poco. Le lettere le ho scritte. Il film l'ho visto. In conclusion, this is the purpose of the passato prossimo. It's a compound tense that's made from an auxiliary and a lexical past participle. Agreement depends on the auxiliary and syntax, and irregular participles originate from high-frequency verbs. If you control the auxiliary, the participle, and the agreement, you can control the passato prossimo, and that's how the concept fully works in Italian. The imperfect past tense in Italian is a simple past tense whose core function is to explain past actions as ongoing, habitual, continuous, and not completed. This tense shows the background of the past, and it does not express completion, known in Italian as the imperfetto. In my previous video, I showed and described the compound past, which has many elements that will not be needed in the Italian imperfetto. This tense is not compound and uses one verb form with no auxiliaries, past participles, or agreements, which means that it's formed by inflecting the main verb itself. Still, the imperfetto will have some irregularities, but in the beginning, we can show the general pattern for regular verbs. To form verbs in this tense, we take infinitives, remove their endings, and add new endings. In this case, the category of Italian verbs matters, because each type of verb will have different endings, and we'll see every single one. Considering regular verbs, are verbs will have the following endings: avo, avi, ava, avamo, avate, avano. Let's take the verb parlare, to speak. To conjugate the verb in the imperfetto, take the infinitive, drop the ending, and add the new endings. Parlavo, parlavi, parlava, parlavamo, parlavate, parlavano. As always, we don't need to say the subject pronouns, and the meaning of the phrases is was or were speaking. Now, let's see a different type of verb, like credere, to believe, which ends in ere. Verbs that end in ere will have these endings. Evo, evi, eva, evamo, evate, evano. Credevo, credevi, credeva, credevamo, credevate, credevano. The meaning of the phrases is was or were believing. Let's finish with the last type of verb, dormire, to sleep, which ends in ire. Verbs that end in ire will have these endings. Ivo, ivi, iva, ivamo, ivate, ivano. Dormivo, dormivi, dormiva, dormivamo, dormivate, dormivano. The meaning of the phrases is was or were sleeping. In general, this is how regular verbs get conjugated in the Italian imperfetto, and when we compare the endings, we see that they all share the same letters, except for the first letter, which is responsible for the type of verb, ending in are, ere, or ire. As a result, the pattern of conjugation is very predictable, because the tense is about unfolding past situations. As a note, it's worth mentioning that expressing an imperfect action can also be done using stare, to be, plus a gerund. This is a structure that I showed when I explained the verb to be in Italian, but here, if we want to emphasize a continuous past action, the Italian imperfect is sufficient. In essence, the existence of the tense is enough to show ongoing past actions, but on the side, we can take imperfect conjugations of stare and apply them with gerunds, like saying, io stavo parlando. I was speaking. English has the concept of saying a continuous past action, using an auxiliary and a gerund, but with no official tense. In Italian, the same pattern is possible, but it's way more specific. When choosing how to express imperfect actions, it's better and easier to use the imperfetto because it conveys the same meaning with no auxiliaries, past participles, or agreements, so the tense is very basic in the language. However, a few systematic irregularities exist, such as verbs that come from older Latin stems. When covering these verbs, it's not necessary to say them because they mainly share similar patterns, like the verbs bere, dire, fare, porre, tradurre. The irregularity is that their stems change while still having the same endings. Principally, all of these verbs end in re, which is a good detail to know because such stem changes also affect verbs that end in orre and urre. Of course, we don't need to show all verbs that have such endings, so it's a simple note to keep in mind. Nonetheless, there is one verb that is completely irregular in the imperfetto, essere, to be. This verb doesn't follow any pattern, so its conjugations must be known individually. Ero, eri, era, eravamo, eravate, erano. Here, the meaning would be was, were, or used to be, because the tense is about continuity and background states. Despite having a few irregularities, the imperfetto is still stable, simple, and predictable. At last, we can finish the lesson with practical examples in all categories of the rules that we've seen. La casa era grande e silenziosa. Mio nonno era molto severo. Faceva freddo quella sera. Studiavamo tutta la mattina. Camminava lentamente. Da bambino andavo al mare ogni estate. Ogni sera guardavamo la televisione. Avevo 20 anni. Era tardi. Pensavo a te. Mi sentivo stanco. Volevo chiederti una cosa. Pensavo di passare più tardi. Overall, this is how the imperfect past tense fully works in Italian. It's a basic tense that explains ongoing and habitual past actions with no auxiliaries, participles, or agreements, so it's a very simple tense in Italian. The past perfect in Italian explains an action that was already completed before another past action, so it places one past event before another past reference point. In Italian, it's known as trapassato prossimo, meaning past perfect, and it's used to show a sequence between past events, explain background causes in the past, and indicate what was already done at a past moment. In English, the past perfect is made from the past tense of the auxiliary verb to have and a past participle, like saying, I had spoken. In Italian, this tense has the same pattern, which means that it's compound, showing the past of the past. Even so, the structure of the trapassato prossimo is the same as the passato prossimo, so it makes other concepts very simple, like choosing the correct auxiliary verb, conjugating it in the imperfect, and adding a past participle, which can have regular and irregular forms. All of these ideas were shown in previous videos, especially in the simple compound past video, so I would highly recommend watching them before continuing with this lesson, because covering these concepts here is unnecessary. You can simply watch the previous videos again, and the Italian past perfect will make more sense. So, to conjugate verbs in the trapassato prossimo, all we do is use the imperfect of the auxiliary verbs avere or essere. The choice of the auxiliary is exactly the same as in the simple compound past, so structurally, the auxiliary logic is the same, just being in the imperfect. Avevo, avevi, aveva, avevamo, avevate, avevano. Ero, eri, era, eravamo, eravate, erano. These are the conjugations we need to make sentences in the past perfect with past participles, and once again, knowing when to use avere or essere is something I already explained in the compound past video. Past participles are also formed the same way, and agreement rules are identical, where there is no agreement with the subject when using avere, aside from preceding direct object pronouns, but there is agreement with essere. In general, the trapassato prossimo has no new irregularities, because its function is inherited from other tenses that we already know. The only conceptual irregularity is that it almost always depends on another past tense or a temporal connector, like quando, dopo che, appena, già. These keywords define the trapassato prossimo, so they're very useful to know. After learning the system, we can see practical examples that encompass the uses of the Italian past perfect. Avevo già mangiato quando sei arrivato. Era stanco perché aveva lavorato tutto il giorno. Non uscimmo perché aveva piovuto. Era arrivata in anticipo. Erano usciti senza salutare. Overall, this is how the past perfect fully works in Italian. It expresses an action that's completed before another past moment, and therefore it's a compound tense, made from auxiliaries avere and essere and a past participle. Auxiliary choice and agreement rules are identical to the passato prossimo, so this tense is relational, explaining the past of the past. The literary simple past tense in Italian explains completed actions that are fully detached from the present. Unlike the simple compound past, this tense shows events as finished, closed, and historically distant, so there is no present relevance, known in Italian as passato remoto. The function of the passato remoto is to narrate historical events, tell stories in literature, and explain completed actions in a remote past. In other words, it's a simple past tense that's very common in written Italian, specifically in literature, but it's still used in speech in some regions. In general, it's rare but stylistic in spoken Italian, and even though you may not use it in conversation, it's good to know for the comprehension of formal Italian. In the remaining videos on the Italian pasts, I will mainly cover the grammar and semantics of the tenses. If you're interested in reading Italian literature, the examples in this video will be helpful, but the emphasis is on meaning. Because the passato remoto is a simple tense, there are no auxiliaries, past participles, or agreements, so its formation will simply have different endings for every conjugation. Again, if you're interested in reading Italian literature, this will be helpful, but if you learn to speak Italian, this information may not be that relevant. For are verbs, remove the ending from the infinitive and add the literary past tense endings, using the verb parlare, to speak, ending in are. Parlai, parlasti, parlò, parlammo, parlaste, parlarono. Now, we can see a different category of verbs, like ere verbs. Here, we have to consider two conjugation patterns, because one uses more formal endings, while the other has a shortened pattern that's very common. Let's see the first pattern with the verb credere, to believe, ending in ere. Credei, credesti, credè, credemmo, credeste, crederono. This is the first pattern for ere verbs, but we can also see the second pattern, which is very common in high-frequency verbs, or verbs that were not regular in Latin. We can see the pattern with the verb mettere, to put, ending in ere. Mettetti, mettesti, mettette, mettemmo, metteste, mettetero. At last, we can see the last category of verbs, which is ire verbs, and these have one pattern. Let's see the verb dormire, to sleep, which ends in ire. Dormii, dormisti, dormì, dormimmo, dormiste, dormirono. So, this is how regular verbs get conjugated in the passato remoto in Italian. However, this tense also has irregular verbs that have essential forms, which are fixed for reading Italian literature, meaning that literary Italian heavily relies on third-person forms, like the pronouns lui, lei, and loro. On the screen, you can see the most common verbs that have irregular conjugations in the passato remoto, and many irregular verbs shorten their stem, double their consonants, or add a vowel in the third person singular form. Assuming that the focus is on speaking Italian as opposed to reading Italian literature, I choose not to go in depth about why the tense has so many irregularities. These forms often come directly from Latin perfect tenses, so these verbs perfectly explain why reading Italian is literary, because it's made for narrative comprehension. The passato remoto is mainly about historical writing, so it's not necessary to say it all the time. For the most part, this is done in the context of reading Italian literature, if you're interested. Nonetheless, in southern Italy, this tense is still used in speech, while in northern Italy, it's mainly written or historical. At the same time, the complexity of the tense is morphological and not syntactic, so it has no auxiliaries, participles, or agreements. As a way to conclude the lesson, we can see examples that are typical in simple narratives with common literary patterns, and such sentences show completed actions, narrative sequences, and events that are perceived as distant and closed. Il re entrò nella città. The king entered the city. Un giorno vide una luce lontana. One day he saw a distant light. Quando arrivò la notte, partirono. When night fell, they left. Appena fu pronto, uscì di casa. As soon as he was ready, he left the house. La battaglia finì all'alba. The battle ended at dawn. Overall, this is how the passato remoto fully works in Italian. It expresses completed actions in the distant past, and it's mainly used in literature and historical narration. Alongside, it's common with third-person forms, and it has many irregular verbs, but with no auxiliaries, participles, or agreements. In modern speech, it's rare, but remains regional. The remote past perfect in Italian is a literary tense of the past perfect that shows a completed action before another past action. Because the tense is very rare, it's almost exclusively used in literary and historical narration. If the remote simple past explains what happened, the remote past perfect shows what had already happened before another event, known in Italian as the trapassato remoto. In English, such a tense is made from the past tense of the auxiliary verb to have and a past participle, like saying, I had spoken. In Italian, this tense has the same pattern, which means that it's compound, having auxiliary verbs, participles, and agreements. Previously, in the Italian past tense videos, I thoroughly explained all of these concepts, especially in the compound past video, so I would highly recommend watching them before continuing with this lesson, because covering these ideas here is unnecessary. Nonetheless, considering how this tense is almost never spoken, it's something I emphasized in the previous video. Literary past tenses in Italian are good to know to understand stylistic and written Italian, but they can be obsolete in practice and speech, especially the trapassato remoto. In this video, we'll see the grammar and semantics of this tense, so if you're interested in reading Italian literature, the examples in this video will help in this context. However, if you learn to speak Italian, this information may not be relevant. The formation of the trapassato remoto is made with an auxiliary verb, avere or essere, and a past participle. Because the tense is about the remote past, we have to use conjugations of avere and essere from the tense, which I showed in the previous video. The choice of the auxiliary is exactly the same as in the compound past, so structurally the auxiliary logic is the same, just being in the remote past, using irregular conjugations. ebbi, avesti, ebbe, avemmo, aveste, ebbero, fui, fosti, fu, fummo, foste, furono. These are the conjugations we need to make sentences in the remote past perfect with past participles. And once again, knowing when to use avere or essere is something I already explained in the compound past video. Past participles are formed the same way, and agreement rules are identical, where there is no agreement with the subject with avere, aside from direct object pronouns, but there is agreement with essere. In general, the trapassato remoto has no new irregularities because its function is inherited from other tenses that we already know. The only thing to note is that it almost always appears in subordinate clauses, introduced by words like quando, dopo che, appena. These keywords define the trapassato remoto, so they're very useful to know. After learning this final concept, we can see literary sentences that are classical in written Italian, and as I said previously, such examples are made simple, in case anyone is interested in reading Italian literature. Dopo che ebbe detto ciò, partì. After he said that, he left. Quando fu finita la guerra, tornò a casa. When the war had ended, he returned home. Appena ebbero concluso il viaggio, riposarono. As soon as they had finished the journey, they rested. Dopo che fu nato il figlio, cambiò la sua vita. After the son had been born, his life changed. Overall, this is how the trapassato remoto fully works in Italian. Just like the past perfect, it expresses a completed action before another past action, but this tense is almost always used in literary and historical narration. It's made from auxiliary verbs and past participles, and it's very rare in speech, but is still important in literature. In conclusion, what I showed across all of these videos is a full study of all Italian past tenses, understanding not just how to form them, but their history, nuance, and literary use. Now, you can review them and let the concepts sink in, as your mastery of the tenses will make reading, writing, and eventually speaking Italian much better, because in the next videos, we will see the future tenses in Italian and how to use them and form them. The simple future tense in Italian expresses actions and states that will happen after the moment of speaking, known in the language as futuro semplice. Its core uses show future actions, events, predictions, expectations, and even polite statements that create a soft tone. In this video, we'll see how to form the tense and when to use it. While the concept may be simple in English, using the auxiliary verb will plus a base verb, the formation in Italian is different. In general, the main rule is to use an infinitive with future endings, which are the same for all types of verbs. Are, ere, ire. Still, Italian has regular and irregular verbs, which I will show later, because for now, it's best to see the formation of regular verbs. For regular ere and ire verbs, the simple future is made by dropping the final vowel e from the infinitive and adding the endings o, I, a, emo, ete, and anno. The accents on o and a are mandatory, and they will be stressed when saying conjugations in context. So, these are the endings that we need to conjugate verbs in the tense, and they're always the same for all verbs. However, when it comes to regular verbs that end in are, there is a small change in spelling, where we need to change a in the ending itself to e, and from there we can add the corresponding endings. Let's see some verbs from every category, starting with parlare, to speak. To conjugate parlare in the simple future, we first drop the final vowel from the verb ending. Then, because are verbs are unique, we change the a to e. Now, we can add the future endings. Keep in mind that some have accents, meaning that when saying them, they will be stressed. Parlerò, parlerai, parlerà, parleremo, parlerete, parleranno. The meaning of the phrases is I will speak, you will speak, and so on. While English has an auxiliary verb, Italian adds endings that fit the tense. Now, let's see a different type of verb, like credere, to believe. To conjugate credere in the futuro semplice, drop the final vowel and add the future endings. Crederò, crederai, crederà, crederemo, crederete, crederanno. The meaning is, I will believe, you will believe, and so on. Let's finish with the last type of verb, like dormire, to sleep. To conjugate dormire in this tense, drop the final vowel and add the future endings. Dormirò, dormirai, dormirà, dormiremo, dormirete, dormiranno. The meaning is, I will sleep, you will sleep, and so on. In general, this is how regular verbs get conjugated in the futuro semplice, but there are two types of irregular verbs in this tense. Those with spelling changes and those whose stems completely change. Let's see the first irregularity, which has special spelling rules. For verbs that end in care and gare, Italian has to maintain the hard sound of k and g. And to achieve that, we have to add the letter h. This rule is done for better sound purposes and to keep the hard sound as it's originally said in the infinitive. And a good example is in the verbs cercare, to search, and pagare, to pay. When conjugating such verbs in the futuro semplice, remember to add the letter h to keep the hard sound. Cercherò, cercherai, cercherà, cercheremo, cercherete, cercheranno. Pagherò, pagherai, pagherà, pagheremo, pagherete, pagheranno. Aside from this rule, there is a different rule for verbs that end in ciare and giare, like mangiare, to eat, and cominciare, to start. When conjugating such verbs, we drop the letter I. Mangerò, mangerai, mangerà, mangeremo, mangerete, mangeranno. Comincerò, comincerai, comincerà, cominceremo, comincerete, cominceranno. These kinds of verbs are the first irregularity in the futuro semplice, but we also have to see the verbs whose stems change. In this case, many verbs have irregular stems, but luckily, they all use the same endings. Of course, knowing all irregular verbs is impossible, so it's better to memorize the most common irregular stems and then apply the endings that we already know, like in the verbs essere, avere, fare, dire, andare, venire, stare, dare, potere, dovere, volere, sapere, vedere, vivere, tenere, and rimanere. Every verb that you see has a different irregular stem, but the conjugations will still use the same endings. Even so, a small pattern that you can notice is that many verbs drop the final vowel before R, and some verbs double this letter. So, this is how you conjugate all types of verbs in the futuro semplice. After learning the system, it's best to practice the tense with common future time expressions, like domani, dopodomani, stasera, stanotte, la prossima settimana, in futuro. As I said at the start of the video, the futuro semplice can show future actions and events, and we can see such examples. Domani parlerò con Maria. Studieremo italiano questa sera. Lui dormirà presto. At the same time, the tense can talk about predictions, probability, and even polite statements. Pioverà stasera. Sarà stanco dopo il lavoro. Avrà circa 30 anni. Dov'è Luca? Sarà a casa. Le farò sapere. Vedremo. As you can see, Italian has interesting ways to express statements that in English would often use different words, like must or probably, even showing predictive use, which is very common in the language. Overall, this is how the simple future fully works in Italian. It's used for future actions, predictions, and probability, and it has one set of endings with predictable regular verbs and common but finite irregular ones. The future perfect in Italian is a compound tense that expresses an action that will be completed before another future moment or is assumed to be completed. In Italian, it's known as the futuro anteriore, and is the English equivalent of saying will have done. Its core function is mainly show an action that is completed before another future action. So formally, the tense marks the earlier or anterior future action that is coming before in time. That's why it's called the futuro anteriore in Italian. Alongside, we can use it to speculate about something that has probably already happened, thereby putting emphasis on completion. Generally, the structure of the futuro anteriore is compound, made from the simple future of the auxiliary verbs avere, to have, or essere, to be, and a past participle. This is a pattern that I thoroughly explained in many of the previous Italian concepts, specifically in the compound past video, so I would highly recommend learning the ideas before continuing with this lesson. Even though the pattern was shown in other tenses, the structure still applies in the futuro anteriore because it's compound. Considering how the simple future will be used in the auxiliary verbs, this is something that I also showed in the previous video, so you can check it out. Before showing conjugations in the tense, it's best to recap the function of the auxiliary verbs avere and essere, which again, I explained many times in previous videos. When avere is the auxiliary, past participles are not affected by agreement, unless there is a preceding direct object pronoun. But when essere is the auxiliary, participles will always change because of agreement rules, where they must match the gender and number of the subject, especially in verbs of movement and reflexive verbs. Now that we've seen the summary of these verbs, we can finally know how to conjugate verbs in the futuro anteriore. The formation will use the simple future of avere and essere with a past participle, similar to saying will have in English. In Italian, every subject will have a different conjugation, which again, I showed in the previous video. The choice of the auxiliary is exactly the same, just being in the simple future, using irregular conjugations. Avrò, avrai, avrà, avremo, avrete, avranno. Sarò, sarai, sarà, saremo, sarete, saranno. These are the conjugations we need to make sentences in the futuro anteriore with past participles. So generally, the tense has no new irregularities because its formation is inherited from other tenses that we already know. The only thing to note is that the tense is best used with common time expressions like quando, dopo che, entro, già, prima che. The last phrase typically triggers the subjunctive in the second clause, which is a concept for a different video. After learning this final concept, we can see basic sentences with regular verbs, irregular participles, verbs with essere, and reflexive verbs. This way, the practice gives more realism with variety. Avrò parlato con il professore entro domani. Avremo finito il lavoro alle 6. Avremo visto il film. Sarò arrivato in tempo. Saremo partiti prima di mezzogiorno. Mi sarò svegliato presto. Besides these sentences, we can see practical examples with the function of each one, such as when English replaces certain phrases, like must have or probably. In one way, the future perfect in Italian creates a future assumption about a past action, speculating about something that must have happened or probably already happened. That's why English replaces such phrases. Quando avrò finito, uscirò. Avrà dimenticato le chiavi. Saranno già partiti. Entro domani avrò scritto il saggio. Overall, this is how the futuro anteriore fully works in Italian. It's a compound tense that's used for completed future actions and assumptions, which is very common in Italian writing and speech. The conditional mode in Italian expresses actions that happen under a condition, whether it's real or imaginary. It's called a conditional because the action depends on something else, and in English, we often use would, could, or should to express conditionals. In Italian, however, two conditionals are similar to English. The present conditional, which is the equivalent of would do, and the past conditional, translating to would have done. In this video, we'll see the two types of Italian conditionals, along with if clauses, because they're a crucial part of the mood. Let's begin with the condizionale presente, which is the English equivalent of would plus a verb. To conjugate verbs in this mood, we have to understand the formation, which is built from future verb stems plus conditional endings. While English has an auxiliary verb would, Italian uses future verb stems with conditional endings that we need to learn. I already made a video about the simple future in Italian, so I highly recommend watching it before continuing with this lesson, but we can recap the concept here. For regular ere and ire verbs, drop the final vowel and get the stem. Regular are verbs will also drop the final vowel, but will change a to e. These are regular stems from the simple future tense, but there are many irregular stems, which again, I showed in the future tense video. After learning how to make stems, we can see conditional endings for the present conditional. Ei, esti, ebbe, emmo, este, ebbero. These are the endings we need to conjugate verbs in the condizionale presente, along with verb stems. Let's see the verb parlare, to speak. To conjugate parlare in this mood, we take its future stem, change a to e, and add the conditional endings. Parlerei, parleresti, parlerebbe, parleremmo, parlereste, parlerebbero. The meaning of the phrases is I would speak, you would speak, and so on. This is the formation of verbs in the condizionale presente, and the endings apply to all verbs, but the stems may be different. As a rule of thumb, it's best to know the most common irregular stems to practice usual speech, like andare, avere, essere, dovere, potere, sapere, vedere, vivere, volere, rimanere, tenere, venire. After learning this mood, we can see when to use it. In Italian, its main use is politeness, which is very common, like saying vorrei un caffè, potrebbe aiutarmi, dovresti studiare di più. On the other hand, the mood can be used for hypothetical situations that are made from an if clause. In this case, the imperfect subjunctive is involved, which I will show in a different video, but for this lesson, I will simply mention the pattern with an example. Later in the video, I will specify the idea more. In the present conditional, the pattern of an if clause has se, meaning if, the imperfect subjunctive, and the present conditional. An example can be se fossi ricco, viaggerei. Se avessi tempo, verrei. For now, do not worry about the subjunctive. Other uses of this mood are the future in the past, wishes, and desires, like saying ha detto che sarebbe venuto. Vorrei vivere in Italia. So, this is how the present conditional works in Italian. Now, we can see the condizionale passato, which is the English equivalent of would have plus a past participle. This mood is different from the present because it's mainly used for regret and the unreal past. In this case, we also have to work with past participles, which are affected by gender and number, depending on the auxiliary verb. Italian has two auxiliary verbs, avere, to have, and essere, to be, and we'll see their conjugations in this mood. However, this formation is compound, which I highly emphasized in many of the previous Italian videos. As always, you can watch them before finishing this lesson. The formation of the condizionale passato uses the conditional form of avere and essere. Avrei, avresti, avrebbe, avremmo, avreste, avrebbero. Sarei, saresti, sarebbe, saremmo, sareste, sarebbero. These are the conjugations we need to make phrases in this mood, with past participles, which again are affected by gender and number when essere is the auxiliary. After learning the condizionale passato, we can see when to use it. The most common use is the unreal past that shows regret. In this case, the pattern also uses se with the imperfect subjunctive, but the result will use the past conditional. An example is: Se avessi studiato, avrei passato l'esame. If I had studied, I would have passed the exam. Aside from the unreal past, this conditional can also be used for missed obligation in a completed future in the past, like avresti dovuto chiamarmi. Ha detto che sarebbe arrivato tardi. So, this is how the past conditional works in Italian. After learning the system, it's best to practice with the most common sayings in the conditional. Such phrases are used a lot in Italian speech, but the main concept to comprehend is the distinction between the present and past hypothetical. Even so, this idea is logic-based because we connect the mood with time and a level of reality. As a result, the language has if clauses, which are important in the conditional. Before ending the lesson, I will show how the role of the mood is influenced by if clauses, without fully explaining the subjunctive yet, because that concept needs a different video. Every Italian if sentence has two parts: the condition, or the if part, and the result, showing what happens if that condition is met. As such, the conditional mood only appears in the result, so it depends on how real or unreal the situation is. Italian has three types of if clauses, and each one shows a different level of reality. 1 is real, 2 is possible but imaginary, and 3 is impossible. You can even see the English idea. Type 1 shows a real possibility that can happen, but it doesn't use any conditional conjugations. The pattern follows se plus the present, and the result can be in the future, present, or imperative. An example is: Se piove, resto a casa. This situation is realistic, so we don't use the conditional in this if clause. Type 2 shows the unreal present with possible but imaginary situations, and this is where the conditional comes in. The pattern follows se plus the imperfect subjunctive, and the result uses the present conditional. To make this concept easier, let's reuse some of the previous examples. Se fossi ricco, viaggerei. Se avessi tempo, verrei. Here, we know the condition is not true, so the result is not real, depending on an imaginary condition. Type 3 is about the unreal past and regret. This type is for things that cannot change, and its pattern follows se plus the imperfect subjunctive, with the result being in the past conditional. Once again, let's reuse an example. Se avessi studiato, avrei passato l'esame. Here, the role of the conditional shows the result as something that never happened. In conclusion, if all of these concepts are too difficult to understand, that's perfectly fine, because we can see the summary of the conditional's role in all types of if clauses, so they tell us that the result exists in imagination and not in reality. In this video, the topic could have felt hard because of real and unreal situations, but that's a thinking skill when learning complicated concepts. To better understand the Italian conditionals, always ask, is this situation real, possible, imaginary, or impossible? Once your brain starts categorizing situations, the grammar will be simple, and it means that your brain is building a new system of thinking. You don't need to be fast, but you do need to be aware. So, this is how the conditional mood and if clauses fully work in Italian. The imperative mood in Italian gives commands, advice, instructions, orders, and invitations by telling someone to do or not to do something. While English keeps the mood very simple by using the forms of infinitives, Italian has a different system. The true imperative only applies to certain pronouns. Tu, lei, noi, and voi. And in this video, we'll see the forms of each one. Let's begin with the pronoun tu and regular verbs that end in are. Here, we use the present indicative conjugation of the tu pronoun, so their formation is quite simple, as we can see with the verbs parlare, mangiare, studiare. The imperative takes the present indicative of tu and puts an exclamation mark for emphasis. Parla, mangia, studia. For regular ere and ire verbs, this is where we consider the present subjunctive conjugation of the tu pronoun. And even though this topic is for the next video, we can show the imperative formation here and later understand how it also works in the mood. Verbs like prendere, leggere, dormire, and sentire have the following imperative forms. Prendi, leggi, dormi, senti. At the same time, we can see irregular imperatives in the tu pronoun that are very common in speech. Of course, knowing all irregular forms is impossible, so it's best to learn the most common ones like si, abbi, va, vai, da, dai, fa, fai, sta, stai, di. While some imperatives have two forms, the short ones are more common. Now, we can see the imperative of the noi pronoun, which is equivalent to saying let's in English. Here, we have to use the present subjunctive of noi, but again, the mood will be shown more in the next video. For now, we can just see the form. Parliamo, let's speak. Andiamo, let's go. Mangiamo, let's eat. Now, let's see the imperative of the voi pronoun. This formation is the same as the present indicative of voi, which applies to you all being plural. Parlate, dormite, prendete. At last, we have to consider commands of the pronoun lei, meaning you formal. Here, we again have to use the present subjunctive of lei. Parli, mangi, dorma, prenda. By saying this imperative, Italian speech becomes very polite. After learning the imperatives of all pronouns, it's important to understand what happens when a command becomes negative. While some change form, others stay the same. For instance, to make a negative command with the pronoun tu, all we do is use non plus an infinitive, like saying non mangiare, non parlare, non dormire. It's not non mangia, it's non mangiare. While this form changes, the other pronouns lei, noi, and voi do not change, so we simply put non before the verb. Non parli, non andiamo, non parlate. After learning negative commands, we also have to see how object pronouns are affected. With affirmative commands, pronouns are attached to the end of the verb, which I will show later, but with negative commands, they go before, like saying non mi dire, non ti alzare, non lo comprare. Still, when it comes to reflexive verbs, they work like pronouns, so they attach when positive and come before when negative, like in the following phrases. Alzati, siediti, vestiti, divertiti. Because Italian is very expressive, the use of the imperative matters in speech because it is culturally important and made not to sound rude. Even so, it's common to use it for invitations, advice, and instructions. Vieni. Entrate. Sediamoci. Studia di più. Mescola bene. The last thing to note is the use of double object pronouns in the mood, such as saying, give it to me, which in Italian has an interesting formation. When combining double pronouns, it's common for indirect pronouns to come before direct ones. To recap the concept, we can remind ourselves of what they look like. Mi, ti, li, le, ci, vi, lo, la, li, le. Still, the order of the words matters, because some indirect pronouns will change form to me, te, che, ve when placed before lo, la, li, le. Another reminder should be that the use of li with direct pronouns fuses the words together. Liello, liella, lieli, liele. So, when double pronouns are attached to an imperative command, they stick to the end. With affirmative commands, double pronouns attach to the verb. Dammelo, mandacelo, dimmelo. As a note, when attaching pronouns to short imperatives like fa, da, di, va, the to imperative doubles the consonant. Dammi, fammi, dimmi, vacci. As I showed, it's possible to stack them. Dammelo, fammela vedere, dimmelo. Regarding negative commands with pronouns, they will go before the verb. Non me lo dire, non glielo dare, non ce lo portare. With reflexive verbs, the logic is the same. Siediti, non ti sedere, mettitelo. Considering all of this information, it's nice to see some examples that can be used in real speech, especially with double pronouns. Passamelo, prestamelo, spiegamelo, portaceli, ridammelo. Overall, this is how the imperative mood fully works in Italian. The subjunctive in Italian is a grammatical mood that uses verbs to express an attitude toward an action, such as things that are felt, doubted, desired, judged, or perceived. Linguistically, it doesn't tell us when something happens, but how the speaker feels about it. In these final Italian lessons, I will explain how all variations of the subjunctive work in Italian, but the method will be different, starting with the present subjunctive in Italian. Before learning its formation, it's important to grasp what the subjunctive even is. The subjunctive mood is in a world of reality as an idea, meaning that events may or may not happen in general, thereby creating uncertainty or possibility. If the indicative says, this is, factually, the subjunctive says, this may be, when it can be open to any possibility. The psychology of the mood can appear in sentences where two people's realities are in tension. So, it's the grammar of influence that expresses a subject's attempt to change reality, using emotion, opinion, doubt, desire, judgment, or any other possibility that gives the idea of uncertainty. While such concepts can be good, more often than not, they simply condense the most common uses of the subjunctive, but they don't actually explain what the subjunctive is. This is why I've chosen this approach of teaching the subjunctive first, because it's a mood that represents something more subtle. Conceptually, it's the mood of possibility and uncertainty, so it expresses something that may or may not be real in general. We can collect all of these ideas, put them in many sentences, and see them more reasonably. All of these phrases have the idea of uncertainty, because we don't know if they will happen, and that's why it's called the subjunctive. By saying or simply thinking about these sentences, they all express a possibility that may or may not happen. The fact that a possibility can happen in general is what activates the subjunctive, regardless of what it is. If I express any of these sentences, it doesn't actually mean that these things will happen, and therefore, it creates possibility. The point is that all of these expressions, whether it's will, emotion, doubt, or desire, are all uncertain, thereby opening a possibility. This is the true definition of the subjunctive, not just in Italian, but in any language. Think of it as a bridge between minds, where in Italian, it can be even more specific. Another technique that can be used to understand the subjunctive is the word che. Italian uses the subjunctive mainly after che, because it's activated when one clause depends on another's mental stance. One person's belief, desire, or emotion, and another person's potential action. This concept will be way more logical later in the video. As a cultural and linguistic note, the subjunctive in Italian is more understandable than in English, because the grammar makes it more clear. Since Italian is more expressive, it allows the speaker to acknowledge subjectivity and to avoid declaring something as absolute truth when it's only a perception. Now, after this explanation, we can finally see the present subjunctive in Italian, il congiuntivo presente. To conjugate verbs in this mood, we follow a pattern of a main clause plus che plus the subjunctive, but sometimes the mood will appear in different phrases, which I will show later. For now, we can understand how to conjugate verbs, following two similar patterns, depending on the verb type. Are, ere, ire. For regular are verbs, the pattern follows different endings, where we take an infinitive, drop the ending, and add the following endings. I for io, tu, lui, lei. Iamo for noi. Iate for voi. And ino for loro. For regular ere and ire verbs, some endings are identical, so they're borrowed. However, we have to use the ending a for io, tu, lui, lei, and ano for loro. To know this pattern more, we can see that a switch of vowels happens in some subjects. So, this is how we conjugate verbs in the present subjunctive, and these endings apply to all verbs. Let's see the verb parlare, to speak. To conjugate it in the congiuntivo presente, we take the infinitive, drop the ending, and add the subjunctive endings that match every subject. Once again, make sure that the action is in the stance of uncertainty. Io parli, tu parli, lui, lei parli. Parliamo, parliate, parlino. Although Italian conjugations are sufficient in showing the subject, in the subjunctive, parli is a repeated conjugation, so it's better to say it with the subject pronoun. Now, let's see a different verb, like credere, to believe. To conjugate this verb, take the infinitive, drop the ending, and add the endings that match the subjects. Because subjunctive endings are identical, we can just keep them in mind, except for io, tu, lui, lei, and loro that use a. Io creda, tu creda, lui, lei creda. Crediamo, crediate, credano. Now, let's see the verb dormire, to sleep. To conjugate this verb, take the infinitive, drop the ending, and add the endings that match the subjects. Io dorma, tu dorma, lui, lei dorma. Dormiamo, dormiate, dormano. So, this is how we conjugate verbs in the present subjunctive, but we also have to see irregular verbs. Because Italian has many, it's impossible to list them all. So here, we can see a chart that has the most common ones, but you can definitely find others. In such a case, we don't need to show the individual conjugations of every verb, because all we do is memorize the irregular forms and add the corresponding endings to the subject we decide to use, which apply to all verbs. So, we can remember the endings that I showed before and add them to the forms of any of these verbs. Essere, sia, avere, abbia, andare, vada, dare, dia, fare, faccia, stare, stia, sapere, sappia, venire, venga, uscire, esca, potere, possa, dovere, debba, volere, voglia. After fully learning how to conjugate regular and irregular verbs in this mood, we can have some examples, and here you will really see the idea of uncertainty. Penso che tu abbia ragione. Spero che lui venga. Non credo che sia vero. Sono felice che tu sia qui. Voglio che tu faccia attenzione. The formation of some phrases in English may seem weird, but I rephrase them like that so that you can see the word order in Italian. What all of these sentences have in common is the idea of uncertainty, but they're expressed in different ways, whether it's emotion, doubt, necessity, desire, or even a negation. One of the main concepts that creates uncertainty is doubt, using the following phrases, but at the same time, negative opinions also activate the mood. Dubito che loro vengano. Moreover, we can compare subjunctive sentences with factual expressions in the indicative. This way, the meaning is more understandable. For instance, opinions and thoughts trigger the mood because they make a fact a belief. Lui ha ragione is a fact, while credo che lui abbia ragione is a belief that I express as a speaker. The same is true about wishes and desires, like saying, voglio che tu vada. Because I have a different subject, I create the subjunctive. With the same subject, I would have the indicative. Voglio andare is a fact, while voglio che tu vada is a belief. Additionally, impersonal constructions also take the subjunctive because of the same concept, like saying, è importante che tu studi. Considering this concept, the subjunctive can activate even after some conjunctions, because they become part of a separate clause when used in context. Prima che, affinché, benché, a meno che, purché. An example is, ti chiamo prima che tu parta. Overall, this is how the congiuntivo presente fully works in Italian. The main rule to know is the difference between something presented as a fact or uncertainty. So in the final Italian videos, we'll see how all subjunctives are formed in the language. The past subjunctive in Italian expresses an action that is uncertain, desired, doubted, or emotional in the past, known as il congiuntivo passato. If the present subjunctive indicates an action happening now, the past subjunctive shows an action that already finished. In my previous video, I provided a comprehensive explanation of what makes the mood as a whole, later illustrating the Italian present subjunctive. I highly recommend watching the previous video before continuing with this lesson, as it will help you understand all subjunctives in Italian. Thus, it's not necessary to explain the mood in this video. we should already know what it is and what makes it, so we can immediately start with the formation of the past subjunctive. Because it is the past, its formation is compound, using auxiliaries and past participles. The auxiliary verbs avere, to have, and essere, to be, will be conjugated in the present subjunctive instead of the indicative. Considering the use of auxiliaries and participles, I thoroughly explained these topics in previous Italian videos, so again, I recommend that you watch them too. In the previous video, I also showed subjunctive endings, which will be needed in the congiuntivo passato. Because the two verbs have irregular forms, we have to remember and use them in the present subjunctive with a past participle. This way, we create the pattern of the past subjunctive. Also, don't forget that essere is used with verbs of movement and reflexive verbs, and that past participles must agree in gender and number with the subject. So, these are the conjugations that we will need to form the past subjunctive, which will be in the stance of uncertainty. Io abbia, tu abbia, lui, lei abbia, abbiamo, abbiate, abbiano. Io sia, tu sia, lui, lei sia, siamo, siate, siano. Although Italian conjugations are sufficient in specifying the subject, some are repeated and borrowed, so it's better to say them with the subject pronoun in context. So, this is how the congiuntivo passato is formed, and we use it with the same triggers as the present subjunctive, such as opinion, doubt, emotion, desire, and impersonal expressions. Penso che lui abbia sbagliato. Dubito che loro abbiano capito. Sono contento che tu sia venuto. Voglio che tu abbia finito entro domani. È possibile che abbia perso il treno. As we can see, the subjunctive is always in the subordinate clause, showing a completed action before the moment of speaking. You can also see how the idea of uncertainty really works, because the sentences use a demand, doubt, or emotion, which may seem weird, but they all make the subjunctive. Even so, when comparing the concept to the present, we see that uncertainty is the main purpose, regardless of the time and tense. The present is about something simultaneous, while the past shows an earlier action. The last thing to note about the congiuntivo passato is that there are no irregular unique forms in this mood. The only technical irregularities are the forms of the auxiliaries and past participles. Once you've chosen the auxiliary, the participle follows the same pattern as in the compound past, which means that any verb that has an irregular participle in the indicative will have the same form in the subjunctive, like the ones that you see on the screen. If you want to know the most common participles, the compound past video will immensely help in this case, but the point is that the past subjunctive doesn't introduce any new irregular forms. It simply takes subjunctive endings and combines them with avere and essere in the present subjunctive, along with past participles. Once you've mastered these two concepts, the rest will be simple. Overall, this is how the congiuntivo passato fully works in Italian, and in the next video, the imperfect subjunctive will be explained. The imperfect subjunctive in Italian is a grammatical mood that expresses mental, emotional, and hypothetical situations in a past unreal frame, known in Italian as il congiuntivo imperfetto. In previous videos, I explained the role of the subjunctive, which will be applied in the same way here. Even so, in my conditional video, I presented Italian if clauses, which will be crucial in the imperfect subjunctive. Finally, we can see how to form the mood in this video, but it's not necessary to explain the function of the mood, because we should already know it from previous videos. So, the congiuntivo imperfetto appears in three main situations: past reporting of emotions, hypothetical and unreal situations, or if clauses, and politeness. To form the mood, we follow a basic pattern, where we take an infinitive, drop re, and add subjunctive endings that apply to all verbs. Essentially, such endings will always be the same for any verb, whether it's regular or irregular. Si, si, se, simo, ste, sero. Let's see the verb parlare, to speak. To conjugate parlare in the imperfect subjunctive, take the infinitive, drop re, and add the subjunctive endings. Once again, make sure that the action is in the stance of uncertainty. Io parlassi, tu parlassi, parlasse, parlassimo, parlaste, parlassero. Although conjugations are sufficient in specifying the subject, the conjugation for io and tu is repeated, so it's better to say it with the subject pronoun. Now, let's see a different verb, like credere, to believe. To conjugate credere, we follow the same pattern as before. Io credessi, tu credessi, credesse, credessimo, credeste, credessero. Now, let's see the verb dormire, to sleep. To conjugate dormire, follow the same pattern. Io dormissi, tu dormissi, dormisse, dormissimo, dormiste, dormissero. So, this is how regular verbs get conjugated in the congiuntivo imperfetto. However, we have to see how irregular verbs also work, and in this case, it's important to consider verb stems, because as I said before, imperfect subjunctive endings will always be the same for any verb. Because this mood is common in Italian speech, irregular verbs will be used a lot, so it's good to know what they look like and when to use them. The irregularity typically comes from the same stem changes that you could have found in previous Italian videos, especially from the remote past, so there are no new random forms. A good pattern to consider is to remember the dictionary stems of many irregular verbs, and then add s or is plus the endings. Unlike previous subjunctives, the congiuntivo imperfetto is more predictable, so we only need to memorize the stems of common irregular verbs, like essere, avere, fare, dire, andare, stare, venire, potere, dovere, volere, sapere, tenere, bere, rimanere, porre, dare. Looking at the chart, I decided to show the conjugations for the pronoun io, because the irregular conjugations simply change their stems. Once you know the stem of one conjugation, the rest follow the endings I showed before. Now, we can finally see some examples of when to use this mood. The main use is in reported past emotions, where the main verb is in a past tense, and the subordinate clause is in the imperfect subjunctive, like saying, pensavo che lui fosse stanco. Credevo che tu avessi ragione. The second use is hypothetical if clauses, which is a topic that I emphasized in my conditional video. So here, we can understand the importance of the subjunctive. We should remember that Italian has multiple types of if clauses, and most express unreal situations in the present or past. The formation follows se, meaning if, plus the imperfect subjunctive, and the result can use the present or past conditional. For these examples, we can have the phrases that I showed in the conditional video. Se fossi ricco, viaggerei. Se avessi studiato, avrei passato l'esame. The first sentence is in conditional type 2, where the condition is not true and the result is not real. The second phrase is in conditional type 3, showing the result as something that never happened, so it's an unreal situation. The third use of the imperfect subjunctive is politeness, or a softening of a tone. By using this mood, we make requests sound less direct, like saying, Volevo che mi aiutassi. Speravo che venissi. At last, the mood can also be triggered after certain conjunctions, when the main verb is in the past. Prima che, benché, affinché, etc. An example is Ti ho chiamato prima che tu partissi. On a final note, we can see some examples that are practical in everyday speech. Although it's a complicated mood, it's still used by native speakers in Italy, mainly for imagination, thoughts, and uncertainty. Pensavo che lui fosse a casa. Credevo che loro sapessero. Volevo che tu facessi attenzione. Se io potessi, lo farei. Overall, this is how the congiuntivo imperfetto fully works in Italian, and in the next video, we'll see the last subjunctive, which is the past perfect. The past perfect subjunctive in Italian is the grammatical mood that expresses a completed action that happened before another past reference point that is mental, emotional, or hypothetical. Being the final subjunctive, this mood is compound, just like the past subjunctive, known in Italian as il congiuntivo trapassato. We can think of it as saying, I thought that he had already done, if I had known, etc. Because it is the past, its formation is compound, with past participles and auxiliaries avere, to have, and essere, to be, which will be conjugated in the imperfect subjunctive. The two topics were thoroughly explained in previous videos that talk about Italian past tenses and subjunctives, so as always, I highly recommend watching those videos before finishing this lesson. Because the auxiliaries have irregular forms, we have to use them in the imperfect subjunctive, with a past participle. This way, we create the structure of the past perfect subjunctive. Also, don't forget that essere is used with verbs of movement and reflexive verbs, and that past participles must agree in gender and number with the subject. So, these are the conjugations that we will need to form the past perfect subjunctive, which will be in the stance of uncertainty. Io avessi, tu avessi, avesse, avessimo, aveste, avessero. Io fossi, tu fossi, fosse, fossimo, foste, fossero. Although Italian conjugations are sufficient in specifying the subject, some are repeated, so it's better to say them with the subject pronoun in context. So, this is how the congiuntivo trapassato is formed, and similarly, we use it in the same cases as the imperfect subjunctive, such as reported thoughts in the past about an even earlier past, se clauses, and certain conjunctions. When it comes to reported past emotions, the main verb is in the past, while the subordinate action is already completed before that, like saying, Pensavo che lui avesse capito. Likewise, the mood is essential with se clauses that use the past conditional, specifically type 3. Instead of having the imperfect subjunctive, we can use the past perfect subjunctive, which basically puts the auxiliaries in the imperfect. So the pattern follows se plus the congiuntivo trapassato, and the result is in the past conditional. An example is Se avessi saputo, sarei venuto. At last, the mood can also come after conjunctions in a past frame, because they create a subordinate clause that refers to a completed past action, like prima che, benché, affinché, a meno che. An example is ti ho chiamato prima che tu fossi uscito. Even so, when comparing the mood to previous subjunctives, we see that it's about a mental, earlier, completed past. So that's how the mood really works. By understanding when to use it, we can see some practical examples that are used in everyday speech. Pensavo che lui avesse ragione. Credevo che tu avessi finito. Dubitavo che loro fossero arrivati. The last thing to note about this mood is that it has no new irregular forms, because the only technical irregularity comes from auxiliaries and irregular past participles, which are always the same in any tense or mood. What's important to understand about the congiuntivo trapassato is that a clause can depend on a past mental verb. So if you say, had done, in English, it would mean that the reality is inside a thought, doubt, regret, or hypothesis, because the mood shows the speaker's attitude toward the action. In conclusion, this is how all subjunctives are formed and used in Italian, and this is what I've shown across all final Italian videos. In the conclusive video, after this one, I will show 100 phrases that are useful to know and say in Italian, so that way the entirety of Italian grammar will finally be finished. This final video will show 100 useful phrases to know in Italian speech. With 100 useful phrases, you can understand Italian grammar in everyday Italian. Although it takes time to learn a language, it's best to do so starting with the grammar, which is the basis of any language. Even though you might not use all of it, you will definitely understand which elements are the most significant. Across every video that I put out, I included examples from all types, so the following 100 phrases will use grammar of all kinds. This is precisely what I've shown in every Italian video, covering many verbs, structures, and moods. Everything that you need to know in Italian is in those videos, so it's definitely important to know how it works. By understanding the basics of grammar, you will have the threshold of fluency, where many concepts become part of your speech. For the final time, congratulations on completing the Italian language and its basis, along with how to use it. These 100 phrases will immensely help in speaking Italian practically, so let's see them. Let's begin with the greetings and politeness. Ciao, come va? Buongiorno, piacere di conoscerti. Buonasera, tutto bene. A dopo. A presto. Mi fa piacere vederti. Scusa il disturbo. Grazie mille per l'aiuto. Di niente. Ci sentiamo. Now, let's see some sentences for small talk and daily conversation. Che fai oggi? Com'è andata la giornata? Fa bel tempo oggi, considerato il periodo. Ultimamente sono molto impegnato. Ho bisogno di una pausa. Non vedo l'ora. Dipende dalla situazione. Vediamo come va. Hai ragione. Hai torto. Now, we have sentences for travel and transportation. Dov'è la fermata dell'autobus? A che ora parte il treno? Quanto costa il biglietto? Vorrei prenotare una stanza. Ho una prenotazione a nome di? Quanto ci vuole per arrivare? Mi sono perso. Puoi indicarmi la strada, per favore? Il volo è stato cancellato. Preferirei partire domani. Now, some phrases for restaurants. Possiamo vedere il menù? Cosa ci consiglia? Sono allergico a questo ingrediente. Prendo questo. Era davvero buonissimo. Il conto, per favore. Possiamo pagare separatamente? È incluso il servizio. Ho già mangiato. Offro io. Now, some phrases for shopping and money. Quanto viene in totale? È troppo caro. Ha una taglia più grande? Piccola? Posso provarlo? Posso provarla? Accettate carte di credito? C'è uno sconto. Lo prendo. Posso restituirlo? Sto solo guardando. Vale la pena comprarlo. Now, some sentences for work and professional life. Lavoro in questo settore da anni. Potremmo parlarne più tardi. È importante che tu sia puntuale. Le farò sapere. Sono d'accordo con la proposta. Non sono convinto. Abbiamo una scadenza. Preferirei un'altra soluzione. Grazie per l'opportunità. È stato un piacere collaborare. Now, some phrases for email and messages. Ti chiamo più tardi. Non ho campo. Puoi mandarmi un messaggio? Ho appena risposto all'email. Ti scrivo appena posso. Scusa il ritardo nella risposta. Resto in attesa di una risposta. L'allegato è corretto. Fammi sapere. Possiamo sentirci in settimana. Now, some sentences for problems and emergencies. C'è un problema. Non funziona. Ho bisogno di aiuto. Mi hanno rubato il portafoglio. Ho perso i documenti. Devo risolvere questa situazione. È urgente. Non è colpa mia. Può succedere. Per fortuna va tutto bene. Now we have opinions and emotions. Penso che sia una buona idea. Spero che tutto vada bene. Temo che sia troppo tardi. Sono felice che tu sia qui. Dubito che funzioni. Mi fa piacere che tu abbia capito. Credo che avessero ragione. Se fossi in te, lo farei. Se avessi saputo, sarei venuto. È possibile che mi sbagli. Finally, let's finish with closing lines about social life. Ti va di uscire stasera? Ci divertiamo sempre insieme. Che ne dici? Offro da bere. È stata una bella serata. Grazie di essere venuto. Ci vediamo presto, spero. Stammi bene. Buon viaggio. È stato un piacere conoscerti. Overall, this is how Italian fully works as a language. And after knowing these sentences, you've completed your journey as someone who understands how these rules are used in everyday Italian speech. Thank you all for watching this video.